In the summer of 1858, London becomes a city held hostage by its own success. Explosive growth, imperial confidence, and a river turned into a slow-moving sewer. When the heat rises, the Thames stops being scenery and becomes a force. One that reaches into Parliament itself, humiliating authority in public and forcing a modern state to confront a problem it spent decades treating as natural. This is the story of the Great Stink, but also the story beneath it. How people rationalize intolerable systems, how fear behaves like policy, how common sense can be a costume, and how infrastructure, usually invisible, suddenly becomes the most political thing in the world. You're standing near the Thames in June 1858, and London is doing something strange, something almost human. It's trying not to inhale. Because the river, this old famous ribbon of water, has begun to speak in a language nobody can politely translate. It's 1858, and you're standing on the stone edge of the Victoria Embankment area, before the embankment exists, when the river still sprawls and exposes itself at low tide like a guilty secret. The air is warm, too warm, and the light has that washed, bright quality of an early summer that doesn't feel friendly. It feels like scrutiny. You hear the city in layers, the clatter of wheels on uneven roads, the murmur of crowds, the distant metallic cough of industry, and beneath it all, the soft, constant movement of water. But the water doesn't smell like water. It smells like a place that has been used. Not a dramatic smell, no theatrical wave that knocks you over like a villain in a melodrama. It's worse than that. It's steady. It's in the background. It's the kind of thing that gets into fabric and hair, that makes food taste slightly wrong, that turns breathing into a decision. Now picture this. A man beside you, coat, hat, the posture of someone who wants to look unbothered, raises a handkerchief to his face as if he's simply thinking, as if this is a private gesture, but you notice others doing the same. It isn't style, it's survival etiquette. And here's what most people miss. In a city that prides itself on being the center of a global empire, nobody wants to admit the river is winning. But here's the unsettling part. London has smelled bad before. London is a city that treats discomfort like background music. So why, in 1858, does the smell become a crisis, so severe it reaches into the heart of government? To understand the Great Stink, you have to understand Victorian London's most dangerous trick, normalization. By the 1850s, London is enormous. One of the largest cities on earth. People pour in for work, for survival, for the promise that the city sells even when it can't deliver it evenly. And like any fast-growing system, any startup, any empire, any school that keeps adding students without adding hallways, London improvises. It patches. It postpones. For centuries, waste is handled in ways that are messy but manageable when a city is smaller. Cesspits under buildings, night soil collectors hauling waste away, when they actually do. Drains that empty into the nearest ditch, stream, or river, and a general belief that nature will absorb what people produce. But London in the mid-19th century isn't a town anymore. It's a machine. And machines produce heat, friction, and byproducts. Now add one more ingredient: water infrastructure. In the early 1800s, more Londoners get access to piped water. That sounds like progress, because it is. But it comes with an unintended side effect. More water in, more water out. when you give a city more water without giving it a modern way to remove what the water carries, you don't create cleanliness. You create flow. Flow into drains. Flow into sewers that were never designed for this volume. Flow, eventually, into the Thames. And this is where history shifts. The river stops being a boundary and becomes a pipeline. Now picture this. A city whose most famous feature, the river, has been quietly recruited into a job it never applied for. And everyone calls it just how things are, until the heat turns how things are into a public emergency. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the Great Stink isn't only an environmental disaster, it's also a story about belief. Victorian London doesn't think about disease the way we do. Germ theory, the idea that invisible organisms cause illness, is not yet the widely accepted framework. Instead, a dominant idea floats in the air like a rule everybody follows without remembering when they agreed to it. The belief that disease spreads through bad air, through foul smells rising from rot and filth. So when the river stinks, people don't merely think, this is disgusting. They think, this is dangerous. Not metaphorically, medically, morally, politically. The smell becomes evidence. And if smell is evidence, then the summer of 1858 is not just unpleasant. It's a kind of trial. London is put on the stand, and the river is the witness that refuses to stop talking. And the strangest thing is, miasma isn't an obviously silly belief in that world. It's common sense built from experience. Foul places often correlate with sickness. The logic feels airtight until you ask what it misses. If you want a modern comparison, think of it like a corporate scandal where the problem has existed for years, quietly managed by routines, euphemisms, and PR. Everyone inside the system knows it's bad. Everyone outside the system suspects it's bad. But nothing changes until the moment it becomes impossible to rebrand. The Great Stink is that moment. A PR crisis, except the public statement is being issued by the river itself. And the river doesn't do spin. Let's pin this to the calendar. The Great Stink is most associated with the hot summer months of 1858, especially June and July, when heat and low water levels intensify the stench coming off the Thames. And it doesn't just haunt alleyways. It reaches the symbolic core of the nation, the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament meets right beside the river. Reports from the time describe efforts to fight the smell with practical desperation. Cloths and curtains treated with disinfectants like chloride of lime. Attempts to seal interiors from the outside air, as if government could simply close the window on reality. And hovering behind this moment is a recent history of fear. Repeated cholera epidemics in London, notably in 1848-49 and 1853-54. That made questions of air, water, and waste feel existential, especially to leaders who could not afford to look helpless. This matters. By 1858, London doesn't enter the Great Stink naive. It enters already traumatized, already primed to interpret the atmosphere as fate. But here's the tension you can feel under the story. If the smell is danger, then the solution is what? Clean the air, clean the river, move the poor, move the sewage, move the truth. Because every possible fix threatens someone's comfort, someone's budget, or someone's illusion of control. One reason this story works as late-night listening, one reason it gets under your skin, is that it's about the rituals people use to pretend systems are acceptable. Victorian London is full of rituals like that. There's the ritual of looking away, walking faster past certain streets, breathing shallowly, treating suffering as scenery. There's the ritual of moral sorting, convincing yourself that filth belongs to the undeserving, so the city's failures don't feel like everyone's responsibility. There's the ritual of bureaucratic delay, commissions, reports, debates, and the comforting illusion that paperwork is action. And woven through it is a darker truth. London's waste problem is not caused by one villain. It's caused by a civilization scaling up faster than its conscience. A city can hide its mistakes until summer makes them speak. So, why did this situation seem reasonable for so long? Because from inside the 19th century mindset, the city is doing what powerful systems always do. It treats consequences as externalities. The Thames is there, therefore the Thames can take it. The poor live there, therefore the poor can endure it. Disease appears to move like weather, therefore you manage it like weather, reactively, not structurally. And crucially, because the worst effects were often most intense in districts with the least political power, it was easy, almost effortless, for leadership to interpret the crisis as local. Until it wasn't. Until the smell made its way into Parliament's lungs and forced a kind of equality nobody asked for. So, why did this situation seem reasonable for so long? Because from inside the 19th century mindset, the city is doing what powerful systems always do. It treats consequences as externalities. The Thames is there, therefore the Thames can take it. The poor live there, therefore the poor can endure it. Disease appears to move like weather, therefore you manage it like weather, reactively, not structurally. And crucially, because the worst effects were often most intense in districts with the least political power, it was easy, almost effortless, for leadership to interpret the crisis as local. Until it wasn't. Until the smell made its way into Parliament's lungs and forced a kind of equality nobody asked for. And that's when everything changes. Not because London suddenly becomes wiser, but because London's leaders become personally affected. History loves to pretend reform is born from virtue, but more often, reform is born from inconvenience. By the way, if you like documentaries that treat history like a lived environment instead of a trivia list, consider subscribing. These stories take time to build, and this one is going to get stranger before it gets cleaner. Over the next hours, we're going to follow the stink like a thread through the entire fabric of London. How the river became a dumping ground with a respectable name. How belief, miasma, morality, common sense shaped policy more than evidence did. How a crisis can be both real and misunderstood at the same time. And how one of the greatest engineering projects in urban history emerges not from a single heroic moment, but from a long chain of discomfort, denial, debate, and brickwork. Because the Great Stink is not only about sewage, it's about what happens when a civilization's private habits become a public atmosphere. So here's where we are. It's 1858. London is immense, confident, crowded, and quietly overwhelmed by its own output. The Thames has been turned into a working part of the city's waste system. The heat intensifies the river's voice, and a society trained to read smell as danger begins to panic, not only about discomfort, but about what the discomfort means. In the next section, we're going to rewind and ask a dangerous question. How did the Thames, London's proud historic artery, become a ledger of waste in the first place? Because once you see the chain of decisions, small, rational, temporary decisions, then the great stink stops feeling like an accident. It starts feeling like a system, finally telling the truth. For centuries, the Thames is London's bloodstream: food, fuel, trade, gossip, bodies moving through the city like thoughts. And then, almost without ceremony, it becomes something else. A place where problems are dropped and forgotten. It's not 1858 yet. Not quite. It's an ordinary day earlier in the century, and you're standing near the river's edge where the city leans in close. Warehouses, steps slick with use, timber pilings darkened by water. The Thames is busy. It always is. You hear the slap of water against hulls, the shout of a boatman, the scrape of rope over wood. You smell tar, wet grain, fish and smoke. London's whole menu of work. Now picture this. Low tide. The river doesn't just lower, it reveals. Mudflats open up like a page, bits of broken pottery, rotten vegetable leaves, ash, shards of glass. And, less poetically, what happens when a city treats a river as both highway and trash bin? You watch people on the foreshore, workers, scavengers, children, moving carefully, eyes down, picking through what the river has given back. You can feel something in the crowd that's hard to name. A practiced familiarity with the idea that the Thames is not purely natural. It's used. The river is part of the city's body, and like any body, what goes in has to come out. But here's what most people miss. A river can absorb a lot, until a city learns to produce. Waste faster than water can carry it away. So how does a lifeline become a ledger? Not overnight, not by a single decision, by a chain of reasonable choices, each one small enough to defend. To Victorian London, the Thames is old, powerful, and, most importantly, moving. And moving water creates a seductive illusion. If it flows away, it's gone. For a long time, that illusion holds. London grows, but not yet at the speed of the 19th century. Waste exists, but not yet in industrial quantity. And the river, twice a day, gets reset by the tide. Then the city accelerates. By the early to mid-1800s, London's population swells dramatically. The city spreads outward, densifies inward, and becomes a capital that has to feed itself daily like an army. More people means more kitchens, more stables, more workshops, more markets, more of everything that leaves something behind. And waste in this world isn't just trash. It's a whole ecology of leftovers. Horse, manure, everywhere, because the city runs on horses. Ash and soot from coal fires, slaughterhouse runoff and market refuse, household waste, food scraps, dirty water, broken items, human waste, managed by older systems that were never meant for this scale. So London does what large systems do when they grow faster than they're planning. It uses what it already has. It uses ditches. It uses drains. And increasingly, it uses the river. Because the river isn't merely a natural feature. It's also a convenient destination. To Victorian London, the Thames is old, powerful, and, most importantly, moving. And moving water creates a seductive illusion. If it flows away, it's gone. For a long time, that illusion holds. London grows, but not yet at the speed of the 19th century. Waste exists, but not yet in industrial quantity. And the river, twice a day, gets reset by the tide. Then the city accelerates. By the early to mid-1800s, London's population swells, Dramatically, the city spreads outward, densifies inward, and becomes a capital that has to feed itself daily like an army. More people means more kitchens, more stables, more workshops, more markets, more of everything that leaves something behind. And waste in this world isn't just trash. It's a whole ecology of leftovers, horse manure everywhere because the city runs on horses, ash and soot from coal fires, slaughterhouse runoff and market refuse, household waste, food scraps, dirty water, broken items, human waste, managed by older systems that were never meant for this scale. So London does what large systems do when they grow faster than they're planning. It uses what it already has. It uses ditches. It uses drains. And increasingly, it uses the river. Because the river isn't merely a natural feature. It's also a convenient destination. And this is where history tilts. London doesn't just start dumping more into the Thames. It starts building a city whose plumbing is quietly designed to deliver waste to it. Before the Great Stink, much of London's waste is handled through a patchwork that only works when everyone participates and when the city is smaller. A common feature is the cesspit, a storage pit beneath or near buildings where human waste collects. When it fills up, it's supposed to be emptied by night soil workers who haul the waste away, often at night, for reasons that don't need much explaining. This isn't glamorous work, it's essential work. And for a time, it creates a kind of uneasy stability. But as London grows, that stability cracks in predictable ways. Cesspits fill faster. Maintenance costs rise. Landlords delay emptying to save money. Overflow and leakage become common complaints. And while London is getting more people, it's also getting more water. Here's the unsettling part. Cleanliness, real cleanliness, often requires infrastructure, but feeling clean can be achieved with far less. And London, in the early 1800s, starts chasing the feeling. As the 19th century advances, piped water becomes more widespread through private water companies supplying different districts. Coverage and quality vary, and improvement is uneven. More water at home means washing becomes easier, streets are sometimes flushed, and certain kinds of daily life become less visibly grim. But water is a multiplier. It turns solids into flow. So while water access can improve hygiene in one sense, it also increases the amount of wastewater moving through drains and sewers, systems that, in many places, are not designed as modern sewers at all. And this matters. In London, many drains and sewers were historically built for stormwater, rain and runoff, not for the continuous daily load of household waste. Add more households, add more water, add more flushing, and suddenly the city's drainage starts behaving like an accidental conveyor belt toward the giant river. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the shift toward water carriage waste, sending sewage away with water, seems like progress. It's less visible, it's less immediate. It pushes the problem away from your doorstep. If you're a homeowner, it can feel like modernity. If you're a landlord, it can feel like cost saving. If you're a local official, it can feel like momentum, something you can call improvement, without fully paying for the consequences. But the consequences don't vanish, they relocate. And the Thames, sitting at the centre of London, like a stage, becomes the place where relocation collects. This is how cities often fail, not by ignoring a problem entirely, but by moving it into a space that is politically convenient to treat as elsewhere. Now picture this. The river is still used for drinking water in parts of London and also used as the receiver of waste. That overlap, water in, waste out, becomes one of the most uncomfortable facts of the century. The quiet horror of overlap. Drinking from the same system in the 19th century, London's relationship with water is complicated and contested. Access is uneven, quality varies, and many people don't have the luxury of choice. The key point for our story isn't a single pipe or a single company. It's the broader reality. As the river becomes more polluted, the risks rise, especially in a world that doesn't yet have a universally accepted understanding of microbes. People understand contamination through the senses they trust: smell, taste, appearance. And in some districts, the water is described in ways that make it clear the city is sliding towards something unmanageable, whether or not everyone agrees on why it's dangerous. And again, the psychology matters. If danger is invisible and slow, people tolerate it. If danger becomes sensory and immediate, tolerance collapses. The Thames is drifting toward the second category. A modern comparison might be this. Imagine a social media platform that grows wildly, adds features fast, and keeps saying it's connecting the world, while quietly failing to build content moderation, privacy protections, or safety systems that match the scale. At first, the harm is scattered, easy to dismiss as edge cases. Then the harm becomes impossible to ignore, and leadership acts shocked. London's early sewer story is like that. Growth first, infrastructure later, consequences outsourced to the public. Let's anchor the shift in a few solid realities. The Palace of Westminster sits right beside the Thames, meaning the river's condition is not an abstract civic issue. It's physically adjacent to power. London's drainage and sewage governance in this era is fragmented, handled by multiple local bodies rather than a single unified system. That fragmentation is one reason fixes stall. Everyone can argue it's someone else's responsibility. And one major turning point comes just before the Great Stink itself. In 1855, the Metropolitan Board of Works is created to oversee major infrastructure improvements across London. This matters because it signals that the city is, slowly, reluctantly, admitting that piecemeal management can't handle metropolitan-scale problems. That doesn't solve the river overnight, but it sets the stage for the kind of engineering response that will become unavoidable by 1858. Records suggest, and historians broadly agree, that by the 1850s, large volumes of untreated sewage are reaching the Thames through the city's drainage network. The river is being asked to do the work of a sewer system London hasn't properly built yet. And the river is failing that job in the most Victorian way possible. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with an escalating, humiliating presence. But we still haven't answered the deeper question. Why didn't London fix it sooner, especially after cholera? Why did so many smart, powerful people tolerate a river becoming a public health gamble? Why it made sense, belief, class, and the politics of inconvenience. Here's why this made sense at the time. Why the system could persist without feeling insane to everyone inside it. The river was old and seemingly infinite. People live with the idea that nature absorbs human output. That belief doesn't feel like a theory. It feels like reality, because for generations it mostly worked. The worst effects weren't evenly distributed. If you had wealth, you had options: better housing, better streets, sometimes better water access. If you had political voice, you could make your neighborhood someone else's problem. Responsibility was fragmented. When a problem belongs to everyone, it often belongs to no one. Belief systems fill the gaps. Miasma theory, moral judgments about poverty, assumptions about filthy, districts. These ideas help people interpret the crisis without redesigning the city. And there's one more reason, quieter and more human. Most people do not wake up and decide to live inside a disaster. They wake up and decide to live inside Tuesday. London doesn't choose catastrophe. It chooses normality again and again until normality becomes unbearable. Brief atmospheric beat. The river as mirror. The Thames, in this story, is not just a setting. It's a mirror. It reflects what London wants to be. Imperial, modern, unstoppable. And it reflects what London refuses to face. Its waste, its inequality, its shortcuts. A city can hide its mistakes until summer makes them speak. We'll let that line rest now. We'll return to it later when the heat really arrives. So here's the shape of Section 2. The Thames starts as a lifeline, trade, water, movement. London grows faster than its planning. Older waste systems strain. More piped water means more wastewater flow. Drains built for rain become channels for sewage. Governance is fragmented. And by the 1850s, the river is no longer just a river. It's a receptacle for a metropolis that's trying to look modern without paying the full price of modern infrastructure. Now, in the next section, we're going to step out of the riverbank and into the streets. Because the Thames isn't the only place where London's waste problem lives. We're going to meet the city as it actually feels day to day. The markets, the tenements, the crowded courts and alleys where public health isn't a concept. It's a gamble you take every morning. And once you see how ordinary life functions in this world, you'll understand why. When the great stink hits, it doesn't feel like a freak event. It feels like the bill arriving. You can measure London's power by what it can import, but you can measure London's risk by what it leaves behind. And in the 1850s, the city is leaving behind everything. It's the mid-1850s, and you're walking through a London street that doesn't feel like a street, so much as a moving corridor of bodies. The air is a layered thing. Not one smell, many. Coal smoke, damp wool, food, horse sweat, spilled beer, raw produce, and the faint sourness that lingers near drains like a memory. Under your boots, the ground is textured with the city's output. Mud, grit, straw, and whatever got dropped and stepped into. Street sweepers exist, but they can't keep pace with the volume. The city produces mess the way it produces conversation, continuously. You pass shopfronts with glass catching weak daylight, then narrow passages where the light thins and the buildings crowd in. Water sits in shallow dips and irregularities. A thin trickle runs along the gutter, brownish, purposeful, on its way somewhere you don't want to follow. Crowds move with practiced avoidance. People learn which parts of a street to walk on, which puddles to step around, how to breathe without thinking about breathing. Now picture this. A child darts between carts, barefoot or nearly so, quick as a sparrow. A woman negotiates a price with a vendor, her attention split between food and the small danger of being jostled. A man in a better coat steps around a smear in the road with a kind of irritated elegance, as if the world has failed him personally. And here's what most people miss. This is not dirt. This is infrastructure. Unofficial, unmanaged infrastructure. It's the system doing its work out in the open. But here's the unsettling part. London's leaders don't wake up and think, let's make the streets unbearable. They wake up and think, we can't stop the city from growing. And then they build a world where growth is treated like destiny. By the 1850s, London is the beating administrative heart of a global empire. Ships arrive with goods and raw materials. Money flows through banks. Information moves through newspapers and offices. Labour pours in from the countryside and from across the British Isles. The city's growth isn't just population, it's complexity. More food requires larger markets. More work requires more workshops, more lodging, more cheap transport. More buildings require more brick, more timber, more coal. More coal means more smoke, more soot, more ash. More people means more waste. And the pressure isn't evenly distributed. London has elegant boulevards and carefully maintained squares, yes. But it also has dense neighbourhoods, where rent is squeezed out of every corner of air. This matters because health isn't just about medicine in this era. It's about space. Space to breathe. Space to store water safely. Space for waste to be removed. Space for sunlight to hit surfaces. When space is scarce, hygiene becomes a luxury product. Now picture this. If you can't afford space, you can't afford options. And if you can't afford options, you live inside whatever system exists, whether it's safe or not. We tend to think of sewage as the story, and it is. But London's daily filth is a chorus, not a solo. Consider the horses. The city runs on them, hauling people, goods, building materials, coal. Horses produce manure constantly, and in a dense city, that production is relentless. Add coal. London burns coal for heat and industry. Coal leaves behind ash and soot. Fine particles drift, settle, mix with dampness, and turn surfaces grimy. Add food markets. Fish, meat, vegetables. Fresh goods create organic waste. Some is collected, much is dropped, spoiled, or trampled. And then add the thing London is trying not to talk about too directly. Human waste, managed by a patchwork of cesspits, privies, drains, and more, water-driven disposal. So the streets become a kind of informal accounting sheet. You can read the city's economy in what it produces and cannot remove. And this is where history shifts. When a city's output exceeds its removal capacity, it starts to feel haunted by itself. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the Victorian city isn't only dirty, it is also obsessed with cleanliness as an idea, a virtue, a performance. You see it in advertisements for soaps, in advice manuals, in middle-class rituals of respectability. Polished boots, washed collars, controlled appearances. Cleanliness becomes moral theatre. If you're clean, you're disciplined. If you're dirty, you're suspect. That moral framing does something very useful for the system. It turns a structural problem into an individual one. If the street smells, it must be because those people are careless. If a neighborhood is unhealthy, it must be because those families are immoral. If disease strikes, it must be because someone didn't live correctly. It's a comforting story because it suggests the system is fine. Only people are flawed. But the system is not fine. And the great stink will expose that, not through argument, but through atmosphere. Here's what most people miss. In a city like this, authority is not only laws and police. Authority is also who gets to define what the problem is. Cogs of governance, fragmentation and delay as a lifestyle. London's public health landscape in this era is divided among many local boards and authorities, each with limited scope and budgets, each able to say, "We can't fix the whole city." This is how delay becomes normal. One district might improve drainage, another might ignore it. One might enforce nuisance laws, another might be too overwhelmed, too underfunded, or too politically cautious. And there's an unspoken political problem. Major infrastructure reforms cost money, and money means taxes, rates, and arguments over who pays. So the system drifts into a strange equilibrium. Enough cleaning to prevent revolt, not enough investment to prevent crisis. That balance holds until nature assists reality, until heat and low water make the hidden visible. Think of it like a city today that launches a glossy green initiative campaign. Beautiful posters, confident press releases, a few symbolic projects, while the underlying pipes, grids, and waste systems keep aging, underfunded, ignored. It's not that anyone is lying exactly. It's that the visible story is easier to manage than the invisible work. Victorian London is full of visible story, morality, respectability, empire. The invisible work, waste removal, lags behind, and invisibility has a deadline. By the 1840s and 1850s, public health reform becomes a serious national conversation in Britain, driven in part by epidemic disease and by the emerging profession of sanitary reformers. A major legislative anchor in the broader British context is the Public Health Act of 1848, which creates a General Board of Health and encourages local boards. Though implementation is uneven and often resisted, especially where costs are feared. And it's worth noting, London is complicated. Not all provisions apply neatly. The city's governance structure is uniquely fragmented. In the metropolis, by 1855, the creation of the Metropolitan Board of Works signals official recognition that some problems, especially sewage and major infrastructure, require coordination beyond parish lines. But between recognition and transformation lies the daily reality. Crowded housing, inconsistent water supply, inadequate drainage, and streets where waste is part of the physical environment. Now picture this. You're a lawmaker who believes disease comes from bad air, and you walk through a poor district where the air is undeniably bad. Your belief feels confirmed, but your belief also points you towards solutions that might miss the real mechanism entirely. And missing the mechanism can be deadly. You can locate this in the city itself. Areas of dense working class housing, often with narrow courts and limited ventilation, become associated with nuisance, disease, and moral judgment. That association isn't neutral. It shapes policy, policing, and public sympathy. And that's important for our philosophy. This story is not only about pipes. It's about who gets blamed when systems fail. Smell is a deeply psychological trigger. It bypasses debate. It goes straight to the body. And in Victorian London, smell carries meanings beyond disgust. It signals poverty to the wealthy. It signals threat to reformers. It signals moral decay to clergy and moralists. It signals political embarrassment to officials. Because the stink isn't just unpleasant. It's public. It's a city failing in a way no speech can smooth over. This is why the great stink matters as narrative. It forces elite Londoners to experience what many ordinary Londoners have been enduring for years. Only now, the sensory boundary between rich and poor starts to collapse. A city can hide its mistakes, until summer makes them speak. So section 3 in a breath. London's growth makes daily life dense and waste constant. Streets carry the byproducts of horses, coal, markets, and crowded housing. Cleanliness becomes a moral performance that often shifts blame onto individuals rather than systems. Governance is fragmented, reform is slow, and the city's just enough maintenance keeps it functioning, until heat and low water threaten to break the illusion. Next, we're going to enter the Victorian mind and ask, what if the smell really was the danger? What if the air, thick with rot and chemistry, was the true carrier of death? Because the most powerful force shaping London's response to sewage isn't engineering at first, it's belief. And in section 4, we'll follow that belief, miasma, as it becomes a theory of everything and a political weapon. In Victorian London, you can argue with a statistic. You can ignore a report, but you can't debate a smell once it's inside your lungs. So the city does what people often do. It turns sensation into certainty. It's the 1850s, and you're in a respectable sitting room not far from the river. Clean furniture, heavy curtains, a bowl of flowers that tries to convince the air it's winning. Outside, the street is alive. Wheels, boots, vendors, distant shouting. But inside, you notice something odd. People keep pausing mid-sentence, just a fraction, like their bodies are interrupting their manners. Someone quietly stuffs a strip of cloth along the edge of a window frame. Another person, trying to be casual, dabs something sharp-smelling, vinegar, disinfectant, onto a handkerchief. They talk about politics, about prices, about the weather, and then the air shifts, almost imperceptibly, and the room changes mood. Not panic, worse, a shared tightening, a communal thought nobody wants to say aloud. If the air is bad, what else is in it? Now, picture this. You step outside and pass a narrow lane where the gutter carries a thin stream. The smell there is stronger, undeniable. A woman hurries a child along, hand on the shoulder, steering them away, as if smell were a physical hazard, like a cart coming too fast. And here's what most people miss. In this era, the boundary between disgust and danger isn't philosophical. It's practical. It shapes where you walk, where you live, who you trust, and what you think the government is supposed to do. But here's the unsettling part. Miasma theory isn't a cartoonish mistake. It's a worldview built from real experience. Foul places often do correlate with illness. So for Victorians, the smell doesn't just seem dangerous. It proves danger. To live in mid-19th century London is to live surrounded by transformations you can see and ones you can't. You can see the city swelling. You can see smoke and crowding. You can see poverty concentrated into tight spaces, but disease. Disease is a mystery that arrives like a knock in the night. Cholera, typhus, fevers. They move through neighborhoods unpredictably from the perspective of ordinary life. A family is fine, then suddenly they're not. A street seems ordinary, then it becomes a rumor. When people don't have microscopes as cultural authority, when they don't have a widely trusted germ theory, they reach for what they can observe. And what they can observe is this. Bad smells come from decay. Decay feels like corruption. Corruption feels like sickness. Therefore, sickness must ride on corrupted air. It's a chain of reasoning that is intuitive, even elegant, especially because it often aligns with a practical truth. Improving sanitation can reduce disease even if you misunderstand the mechanism. this is one of history's cruel tricks. A wrong theory can still point toward helpful actions, just not always the right ones, and not always fairly distributed. Now picture this. If the air is the enemy, then the poor, crowded into places with the worst air, start to look like the source of the threat. And suddenly, public health becomes entangled with suspicion. Once you believe disease travels through foul air, a city's social map becomes a health map. Narrow, overcrowded streets become dangerous. Poor districts become infected. Smell becomes a diagnostic tool. And smell has a politics. Because what smells bad to one class is often how another class is forced to live. The wealthy can pay for distance, for space, for cleaner water and better removal of waste. The poor are left with proximity to drains, to industry, to crowding. So miasma theory doesn't just explain illness. It explains hierarchy. It allows a comfortable person to think, I am safer because I am cleaner, which can quietly become, I am cleaner because I am better. And this is where authority performs. Leaders and institutions can present themselves as guardians of clean air and moral order, even when the underlying systems, drainage, water supply, waste removal, remain inadequate. Miasma becomes a story that makes governance feel possible, because air is something you can talk about in speeches, and if you can talk about it, you can look like you're doing something without rebuilding the city. And here's where it gets complicated, because miasma isn't just a mistaken scientific belief. It's also a psychological technology. It converts fear into a target. If people are dying and you can't explain why, you have two choices: admit you don't know and risk losing authority. Offer an explanation that feels consistent with experience and keep control. Miasma does the second. It offers a villain you can smell. And once the villain is smell, the response can become theatrical. Fumigation, perfuming, purifying rituals, symbolic cleanups that look impressive but don't always address transmission. It's like trying to fix a data breach by redesigning the company logo. It makes everyone feel busy. It reassures the public, but it doesn't necessarily stop the leak. Here's what most people miss. A public health theory isn't only about medicine. It's about what a society is willing to believe, because that belief determines what it's willing to fund. By the early 1850s, there are people challenging the airbase story. Not always loudly, not always successfully. One of the most famous is John Snow, whose work during the 1854 cholera outbreak is often associated with arguing that cholera spreads through contaminated water rather than bad air. His investigation around the Broad Street pump in Soho becomes a landmark example of evidence-based reasoning in public health. But, and this matters, Snow's interpretation isn't universally accepted in his own time. Many officials and influential figures remain committed to miasma explanations, or to mixed explanations that still treat smell as central. This isn't because Victorians are stupid. It's because they are human, and institutions are human at scale. Evidence does not automatically defeat a worldview, especially when that worldview is emotionally satisfying and socially convenient. And if you're an official facing public panic, bad air is easier to communicate than an invisible contaminant carried by water systems people depend on daily. A theory that protects confidence often outlives a theory that threatens it. This is the Victorian version of blaming screen time for every teen problem today: sleep, attention, mood, relationships. Because it's visible, it feels intuitively linked, and it gives adults a lever they can pull. Sometimes the lever helps, sometimes it's the wrong mechanism, but it always offers a sense of control. Miasma is that kind of lever, a simple story that makes a complex crisis feel graspable. Let's plant a few anchors you can hold. 1854. The Soho cholera outbreak and the Broad Street pump investigation associated with John Snow. 1848. Britain's Public Health Act and the growing influence of sanitary reform, an era when public health begins to become a structured governmental concern, even if unevenly applied. 1855. The creation of the Metropolitan Board of Works, which will become crucial for large-scale infrastructure decisions in London. And in daily life, the air is danger worldview shows up in objects and practices, handkerchiefs and cloths held to the face, disinfectants and deodorizers, heavy curtains, closed windows, and attempts to seal indoor life from outdoor atmosphere. It's a culture trying to defend itself with fabric and ritual, because without infrastructure, ritual is what you have. But here's the turn. When the great stink arrives, it doesn't just validate miasma for many Londoners, it weaponizes it. It forces the government into a corner where belief and embarrassment collide, because it fit what people could observe, and it fit what people feared. They could smell rot. Rot felt like corruption. They saw disease cluster in foul, crowded areas. They lived in a world where odors were strong signals, food, fires, bodies, industry. Smell was information. And because miasma theory aligned with the moral language of the time, purity, decency, order, it made disease not just a medical event, but a kind of civic judgment. Most importantly, it offered something every society craves during crisis, a reason that feels understandable, and a set of actions that feel doable. Open a window, burn something, clean a street, blame a neighborhood. It made chaos feel like it had rules. So in this section, London is primed to interpret smell as danger. Miasma becomes a powerful, intuitive theory that shapes policy, blame, and public rituals of purification. Early evidence for waterborne transmission exists, most famously in 1854, but belief doesn't shift quickly, because belief is tied to authority, convenience, and what people can sense. Now we're ready for the next escalation, because belief is about to meet an event so sensory, so humiliating, that it will override years of debate. In Section 5, we enter the cholera years, when death moves through London like a seasonal curse, and the city tries to fight it with the tools it trusts: fear, theory, and performance. And the question that will haunt everything is simple. If the air is the threat, why does the pattern keep pointing back to the water? Cholera doesn't arrive in London like an invading army. It arrives like a change in air pressure, subtle at first, then suddenly undeniable. And the most frightening part is how quickly people learn to treat it as seasonal. It's 1854, and you're walking through Soho, not in the version preserved by tourism, but in the living, crowded neighborhood where work and home are pressed close, together. The street is narrow, and the buildings lean in as if they're listening. The air carries the usual London mixture: coal smoke, cooking, damp brick. But today, there's something else. A kind of brittle tension, like conversation has become cautious. People cluster at doorways, not gossiping exactly, more like monitoring. You pass a shop where the owner is wiping the same spot on the counter again and again, as if repetition could scrub away uncertainty. A woman steps out with a bucket, glances down the street, then back inside, like the outdoors has become suspicious. Now picture this. You come to a public pump, ordinary, familiar, the kind of object nobody writes poems about because it's simply part of life. People approach it with containers, with routine movements, and yet there's a new mood around it. Not full panic. London doesn't panic easily. It does something more Victorian. It tightens its collar and tries to behave. But here's what most people miss. Cholera turns everyday objects into suspects. A cup, a bucket, a handle you touch with your bare hand, a shared source that suddenly feels like a shared risk. But here's the unsettling part. Cholera doesn't fit neatly into the miasma story when you look too closely, because it doesn't just hover, it clusters, it follows lines, like streets, like pipes, like the invisible infrastructure of daily life. Cholera arrives in Britain in the 19th century in waves, and London experiences repeated major outbreaks. By the time we reach the 1850s, cholera is no longer an unimaginable novelty. It's a remembered terror. People have seen it before, or they've heard enough to feel like they have. And that changes psychology. The first time a city meets an epidemic, it asks, "What is this?" The third time it asks, "How long will it last?" That's the moment when tragedy becomes routine. Londoners develop coping strategies, avoiding certain streets, burning substances to purify air, clutching handkerchiefs, blaming nuisances, trusting rumours as much as officials. And officials, public health boards, parish authorities, operate in a difficult space between real responsibility and limited tools. Because the hardest part of epidemics is not only the disease, it's the uncertainty. If you don't know the mechanism, you reach for what preserves authority, explanations that sound coherent, actions that look decisive. And miasma theory offers exactly that. Now picture this, a government that can rule an empire overseas, but can't guarantee safe water in its own capital. That contradiction is the kind of thing that keeps institutions awake at night, if they let themselves think about it. Even without modern microbiology, observers notice things. They notice clustering. They notice that some households are struck hard, while neighbouring ones are spared. They notice that cholera can appear in places that don't smell the worst, and sometimes spare places that do. And in 1854, in Soho, this pattern becomes the basis for one of the most famous investigations in public health history, John Snow's work around the Broad Street pump. Snow argues that cholera is transmitted through contaminated water. He compiles evidence, including mapping cases, an approach that feels almost modern in its logic. But almost modern is the key phrase, because Snow is working against a cultural tide, a century of habits, a professional world where many authorities still interpret cholera through miasma or blended theories. So even when evidence points to water, belief often returns to air, because air is what people can feel. And there's another obstacle. Accepting a waterborne theory implies something terrifying. It implies the city's most basic necessity, water, is compromised. That's not just a scientific claim. It's an attack on the feeling of safety itself. And here's where it gets complicated. Because miasma and waterborne theories aren't always treated as mutually exclusive in the period. Many people hold mixed beliefs. Bad air weakens you. Filth creates conditions for disease. Water might play a role. Smells might signal danger. In other words, the city's understanding is a patchwork, just like its infrastructure. And in a patchwork system, blame moves easily. If cholera strikes, it's because a district is dirty. If a district is dirty, it must be because its people are undisciplined. And if people are undisciplined, then reform becomes moral policing instead of engineering. It's easier to police behavior than to rebuild sewers. It's cheaper too. So belief shapes budgets, and budgets shape outcomes. Here's what most people miss. The debate about cholera isn't only scientific. It's about who pays, who is inconvenienced, and who is allowed to admit the city is failing. It's like a modern public health crisis where people argue endlessly about whether the problem is personal responsibility or system design. One side says, change your behavior, wash more, avoid risk, be disciplined. The other says, redesign the environment, ventilation, water quality, workplace safety, housing. Victorian London leans hard on the first category because it preserves a comforting idea that the system is fundamentally sound and only individuals are at fault. Cholera keeps challenging that comfort. Concrete anchors, major cholera. Outbreaks in London are commonly noted in 1832, 1848 to 49, 1853 to 54, and 1866, the last one coming after many reforms had begun, which becomes its own test of progress. 1854, Soho. John Snow's investigation connected to the Broad Street pump. And here's an important nuance. Historians generally agree Snow's work is pivotal, but its acceptance in the moment is limited. The shift from miasma dominance to germ theory is not a single conversion event. It's a long, contested transition. Records suggest that while some officials removed the Broad Street pump handle, often mentioned in retellings, this action doesn't instantly rewrite London's entire policy worldview. It becomes a symbol later, because symbols are easier to carry than complexity. The lived reality remains. Sewage continues to reach the Thames. Water sources remain variable. Housing remains crowded. Now picture the psychological toll. You live in a city where disease can appear, peak, and fade, like a storm. And you're told it's in the air, so you try to defend yourself with air rituals. When people can't control the cause, they control what they can see. They scrub thresholds. They burn incense or chemicals. They avoid certain places. They gossip about bad streets like they're cursed. And the government performs too. Inspections, nuisance abatements, reports, debates, occasional cleanups that reassure more than they transform. But beneath the performance, the big truth remains unaddressed. London's sewage problem is not a moral lapse. It's a design failure. And cholera, whether understood through air or water, keeps pointing back to the same uncomfortable fact. A city cannot improvise its way out of scale forever, because the alternative was almost unthinkable. To accept that cholera was waterborne was to accept that something as ordinary as drinking could be lethal, that the city's progress in water delivery might be part of the danger. That responsibility might sit with institutions, landlords, and governments, not just with individuals, and that expensive, disruptive infrastructure change was necessary. Miasma theory, by contrast, allowed for solutions that were cheaper, faster, and socially aligned with existing hierarchies. clean the smelly places, discipline the dirty, purify the air, move on. It made the crisis seem manageable without a revolution in public works. And in the short term, societies often choose manageability over truth. So in Section 5, cholera becomes a repeated trauma that London learns to treat like weather. Miasma theory offers a sense of control, but patterns of illness increasingly point to water and infrastructure. John Snow's 1854 Soho investigation becomes an important challenge. Symbolic later, contested in its moment. Meanwhile, belief and class shape policy. Behavior is easier to police than pipes are to rebuild. And now, we're ready to step into the turning point. Because even if cholera terrifies the city, it still allows denial. It comes in waves, it fades. People exhale and return to normal. But in 1858, something happens that doesn't fade quietly. The river itself becomes an event. In Section 6, we follow a different kind of weapon. Not a disease you can argue about, but evidence you can smell. A map will matter. A pump will matter. But first, the city is going to face the terrifying logic of its own system. Laid out in plain, suggests the enemy isn't bad air. It suggests the enemy isn't bad air. It suggests the enemy is the system. It's 1854 again, but we're not in the street this time. We're in the kind of room where decisions are made slowly. You're leaning over a table. The light is thin and grey through a window filmed with soot. On paper, London spreads out. Streets like veins, blocks like dense tissue. Someone, an investigator, a doctor, a reformer, marks the page. One stroke, then another. Small, dark lines accumulating. At first it looks like nothing. Then it begins to look like something you can't unsee. A cluster. Not a vague fog of illness drifting wherever the wind pleases. An actual concentration that hugs certain addresses, certain routes, certain sources of water. Now picture this. You step back from the table, and the map doesn't feel like information anymore. It feels like accusation. Because if disease follows water, then disease is not simply in the air. It is in the pipes, in the pumps, in the shared civic bloodstream. And that means the city's most ordinary habits, drinking, cooking, washing, are implicated. This is why the water theory is not just uncomfortable, it's socially explosive. B-roll suggestion. Slow close-up on a Victorian street map. Ink marks appearing one by one. But here's the unsettling part. Even when evidence is strong, societies don't change instantly. They negotiate with it. They dilute it. They reframe it. They try to keep their old story alive a little longer. John Snow's 1854 work is the famous emblem, but he's part of a broader shift. The slow emergence of a culture that believes the city can be understood through data, mapping, and systematic observation. This is not yet our world of laboratories as ultimate authority, but it is a world beginning to flirt with a dangerous idea. Maybe health isn't destiny. Maybe it isn't moral punishment. Maybe it's design. And design can be changed. But for an empire built on confidence, admitting that your capital's water can kill you is like admitting your palace has termites. It's not just a repair problem, it's a prestige problem. And prestige, especially in Victorian Britain, is not a side detail. It's a form of power. Now picture this. Parliament can order ships across oceans, but it can't control what's in a glass of water. That imbalance, imperial reach, domestic fragility, is the tension beneath the entire Great Stink story. Most people know one dramatic detail. The Broad Street pump handle is removed. It's become a tidy parable. Evidence triumphs, action follows, lives are saved, the future begins. But history is rarely that neat. Records and later retellings suggest the pump handle removal happened in the context of local response and debate. It mattered. It may have helped. It became symbolic. But the larger system didn't transform overnight because the city's water supply was fragmented across providers. Sewage disposal was still broken. Miasma remained culturally dominant in many institutions, and the idea of spending enormous public money on sewers still triggered political resistance. Snow's work is a wedge in the worldview, not an instant demolition. And wedges take time. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the truth about cholera doesn't automatically produce the right policy. Even if you accept that water can carry disease, what do? Filter water, move intakes upstream, build reservoirs, regulate private water companies, build a unified sewer system so waste isn't returning to the water supply. Every option costs money. Every option threatens someone's interests. And every option requires London to admit that its current arrangement is not modern, but improvised. So evidence runs into the oldest opponent of reform. Not ignorance, incentives. Here's what most people miss. Victorian Britain isn't short on intelligent people. It's short on agreement about who should pay for intelligence becoming concrete. The sanitary movement, reformers, reports, and the politics of disgust. This is the era when sanitary reform becomes a kind of moral crusade. Reformers argue that filth breeds disease and social disorder. They push for cleaner streets, better drainage, improved housing, safer water. But even within reform, you can feel competing impulses. One impulse is compassionate, reduce suffering, improve life. Another impulse is disciplinary, control the poor, regulate behavior, impose order. This dual nature matters because it shapes public acceptance. If reform sounds like policing, it breeds resistance. If reform sounds like expense, it breeds opposition. If reform threatens property rights or local autonomy, it becomes political poison. So London stalls, moving forward in rhetoric, backward in budget. Meanwhile, the Thames continues collecting the city's output like a dark savings account. It's like when an internal whistleblower report proves a product is unsafe. But the company responds with committees, stakeholder consultations, and carefully worded statements, because admitting the full truth implies recalls, lawsuits, and reputational collapse. Evidence doesn't just threaten ideas, it threatens structures. And when structures feel threatened, they often demand more study as a way to buy time. Victorian London buys time. The river keeps charging interest. We can anchor the slow pivot like this. 1848, the Public Health Act and the formalization of sanitary concern in governance. 1854, the Soho outbreak and John Snow's investigation. 1855, the formation of the Metropolitan Board of Works, created to coordinate major infrastructure across London. Exactly the kind of body needed if the city is ever going to tackle sewage at scale. And this is crucial. By the mid-1850s, London is already in a transitional period. The debate is alive. The pressure is building. The institutions capable of large-scale action are forming. But the trigger, the moment that makes hesitation politically impossible, has not yet arrived. That trigger is not a map. It's not a report. It's not a theory. Now picture this. All the arguments are waiting in the wings. Miasma, waterborne transmission, moral reform, engineering solutions. And then the weather changes. And suddenly, the city doesn't have the luxury of debating in comfort. Because gradualism feels responsible, especially to those who benefit from the current system. From the inside, delay can look like prudence. We need more evidence. We can't rush expensive decisions. Local authorities know their areas best. Private enterprise can manage water efficiently. The river has always been there. These arguments aren't always dishonest. Often they're sincerely held, but they share a hidden assumption that the cost of delay is tolerable. The Great Stink will reveal the cost of delay in the most intimate way possible, through the simple act of breathing near the river. A city can hide its mistakes until summer makes them speak. Third use will keep the remaining uses rare. Evidence-based thinking begins to challenge the miasma worldview, most famously through John Snow's 1854 Soho work and mapping approaches that reveal pattern. But evidence collides with incentives, fragmented governance, and fear of admitting systemic failure. Reform ideas gather, institutions begin to form, yet London still delays the massive infrastructure investment that would truly change the river's fate. It's the summer, and cholera remains a threat that can return. And now we cross the threshold. In the next section, we step into the chamber where authority performs itself, Parliament, and we watch what happens when governance is forced to sit beside its own consequences. Because in 1858, the Thames doesn't just smell bad, it embarrasses power, and power, when it's embarrassed, either changes or doubles down. There's a special kind of panic that only happens to powerful people, the panic of realizing the problem can reach them. In 1858, the Thames doesn't petition Parliament, it invades it. It's late June 1858, and you're standing inside the Palace of Westminster, not as a tourist, but as someone trying to work while the building itself becomes hostile. The chamber is warm, too warm, the kind of warmth that makes wool feel heavier and tempers shorter. You can hear the ritual sounds of government, papers sliding, pens scratching, low conversation that pretends not to be anxious, boots on stone, a cough that seems to echo longer than it should. And then there's the river. It presses in through the openable seams of the building, the windows, the corridors, the gaps where air must enter because people must breathe. The smell isn't a single note. It's a thick chord. It doesn't shout, it persists. Now picture this. Curtains at windows, heavy and treated with disinfectants, hanging like defensive banners. People dabbing chemicals onto cloths, holding them to their faces with the dignity of a formal gesture, like they're contemplating policy, not trying not to gag. Someone speaks at the dispatch box, voice controlled, while their eyes flick briefly toward a window, as if it might betray them again. And here's what most people miss. Parliament is built to manage conflict through language. But smell is not language. Smell is a physical argument, one you cannot filibuster. But here's the unsettling part. This isn't the first time London has faced a sanitation crisis. It's the first time the crisis becomes inescapably elite. The Palace of Westminster is not just a building. It's a performance space for the idea that Britain is governable, orderly, and rational. In the mid-19th century, governance is deeply theatrical. speeches, votes, committees, published debates, the visible ritual of decision-making. This is how legitimacy is maintained, through procedure. But procedure depends on a stable environment, on the sense that the government can exist above the mess of the street. The Great Stink undermines that separation. It says, you are not above it, you are beside it, you breathe it too. And once the problem is shared by the people who make budgets, the odds of action change rapidly. Not because empathy suddenly blossoms, though individuals may feel it, but because incentives shift. Now picture this. It's one thing to read reports about nuisance in distant districts. It's another thing to have nuisance sitting in the chamber with you, writing itself into your lungs. Before 1858, London's sewage problem is always framed as something that can be managed with incremental steps. Incrementalism is attractive for several reasons. It avoids huge tax increases. It avoids centralizing power away from local authorities. It avoids disrupting commerce. It allows politicians to claim progress without gambling their careers on one vast project. And it also fits a certain Victorian belief in improvement. The idea that modernity arrives through steady refinement, not sudden overhaul. But in practice, incrementalism in sanitation often means partial drainage upgrades, inconsistent enforcement, small-scale cleanups, reports that pile up like unread warnings. The river continues receiving waste. The city continues growing. And then, summer arrives and compresses time. And here's where it gets complicated. Because Parliament is not a single mind. It's a tangle of interests. Property owners, commercial priorities, local political loyalties, ideological commitments to limited government, fear of spending, fear of central authority, fear of admitting failure. Even among those who agree something must be done, they disagree on what and how. Should the goal be to remove smell, because smell is danger? Or to remove sewage from the river, because water is at risk? Or to clean certain districts, because morality is at stake? In other words, the Great Stink doesn't unify London instantly. It forces London to negotiate under duress. And negotiation under duress is rarely elegant. Here's what most people miss. When elites act during crisis, the action is often framed as public virtue. But the trigger is frequently private discomfort. Heat changes everything. It lowers river levels. It concentrates what's in the water. It amplifies odor. It turns an ongoing pollution problem into a sensory siege. And because the Palace of Westminster sits right by the Thames, the state finds itself in the line of fire. Contemporary accounts describe attempts to keep the stench out using treated curtains and disinfectants, efforts that feel almost tragic in their smallness against the scale of the problem. It's like trying to stop a flood with towels. But those towels matter psychologically. They show a government trying to preserve dignity while the environment mocks it. And the press notices. The public notices. The Great Stink becomes not just a sanitation issue, but a legitimacy issue. Because if the government can't protect its own working environment from its own river, what does that say about its ability to protect anyone else? It's the political equivalent of a corporate board meeting interrupted by a building-wide sewage backup. Executives stepping over the mess while insisting the quarterly strategy remains on track. The moment isn't just embarrassing, it's clarifying. It exposes the difference between the story leaders tell, control, competence, modernity, and the reality reality their systems have been quietly producing. The crucial anchor here is that 1858 becomes the year when political will snaps into place. In that year, Parliament passes legislation enabling major works to address London's sewage, commonly associated with empowering the Metropolitan Board of Works to proceed with large-scale construction. This is where Joseph Bazalgette, Chief Engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, moves from being a name inside an institution to being the architect of London's escape route. We'll spend serious time with Bazalgette later, because the engineering is not just technical, it's moral and political. But for now, hold on to the key point. By 1858, the conditions are set for a massive, coordinated sewer project, one that aims to intercept sewage before it reaches central London's stretch of the Thames and carry it away downstream. It is expensive. It is disruptive. It is the kind of thing governments resist until they can't. And then the government acts quickly, as if speed were always possible. And that's when everything changes. Because the crisis doesn't just make Parliament legislate, it forces the city to admit, publicly, that the old normal is over. But admitting and transforming are not the same thing. Because the state's usual tools, debate, committees, incremental reform, had worked for other kinds of problems, and because the ideology of the era often treated massive public spending with suspicion, big centralized projects implied big government, and big government implied risk, corruption, inefficiency, loss of local control. Also because smell-based thinking made some leaders believe the goal was to remove odor, not necessarily to redesign the whole wastewater system. If the fear is miasma, the impulse is to deodorize, literally and politically. And because, until 1858, the political cost of inaction was manageable, then it wasn't. A city can hide its mistakes until summer makes them speak. Fourth use. One remaining later, at the most fitting moment. The Great Stink forces a crisis of governance as performance. Westminster, beside the Thames, can't insulate itself from the city's consequences. Heat turns long-term pollution into immediate humiliation. Parliament's incentives shift, and legislation in 1858 enables the kind of coordinated, expensive public works previously delayed, setting the stage for Bazalgette and the sewer revolution. But now, we need to do something crucial before the stink peaks. We need to walk into the summer itself, because the Great Stink isn't a single day. It's a season, an atmosphere, a city trying to function while its most famous river becomes an instrument of pressure. In Section 8, we begin the summer of 1858 in earnest. And we'll see how a smell becomes headlines, how it rewires behavior, and how the entire city starts breathing like it's under surveillance. The heat doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like a decision the sky has already made. And by the time London notices what the sun is doing to the Thames, the city is already trapped in the same room with it. It's June 1858, and you're crossing a bridge over the Thames. One of those moments where the city opens up and pretends to be graceful. The river below should feel like relief, like space. Instead, it feels like exposure. The light is bright, hard-edged. The stone under your hands warm already. The air has that sticky thickness that makes clothes cling and patience thin. You look down. The Thames is moving, technically, but it's a lazy movement. as if the river has become tired of carrying London. At low tide, the banks show themselves, dark mud, scattered debris, the city's leftovers arranged by water into a kind of unwilling display. And then the smell reaches you, not as a punchline, not as a single wave, but as a steady reality. People around you react in small ways that add up to a collective confession. A man clears his throat too often. Someone laughs too loudly at nothing, an anxious kind of laughter. A woman lifts her skirt hem slightly, not for fashion, but to avoid brushing against damp stone. Several people press cloth to their faces, trying to make it look like thoughtfulness. Now picture this. You walk along the river path near Westminster. Windows are open because it's summer, until they aren't. Somewhere nearby, a window slams shut with sudden conviction. You feel it in the crowd. The city is still functioning, still moving, still buying and selling and arguing and commuting. But it's doing it with the strange discipline of people pretending they are not uncomfortable. And here's what most people miss. The great stink begins not with hysteria, but with denial practiced in public. But here's the unsettling part. This is a city trained to endure. London tolerates soot, noise, crowding, hardship, so for the stink to become a national crisis, it has to cross a very specific threshold. It has to become impossible to pretend it's normal. London has been depositing its waste into the Thames for years. The difference in 1858 is not the invention of sewage. It's the conditions that make sewage unavoidable. Heat does a few things at once. It accelerates decay. It intensifies odor. It lowers river levels and concentrates what's in the water. It pushes people to open windows, then punishes them for it. And June in London is not just a season, it's a social setting. Parliament is in session, courts are busy, commerce is relentless. The city can't pause because discomfort has arrived. In fact, the more unbearable the atmosphere becomes, the more everyone clings to routine, as if routine is a lifeboat. This is how systems behave under sensory assault. They keep going, but they begin to warp. Workplaces adapt in small ways. Households adjust habits. Newspapers sharpen their language. And every adjustment is, quietly, a sign that the city understands the truth it doesn't want to say. The river has become part of daily life in a new way. Not as scenery, not as commerce, but as an antagonist. Now picture this. The stink isn't everywhere equally. It's worst where the river bends near dense activity, where the water slows, where the banks expose more. And that unevenness creates a new kind of social map, one based on who has to breathe what and who can escape. This is the phase where London begins to behave like a place experiencing a crisis without admitting it. Small improvisations spread. People choosing routes that avoid the river, officials discussing nuisance with the tense politeness of people describing an obvious emergency in euphemisms, shops keeping doors shut even in heat, households relying on scented cloths and disinfectants, part defense, part comfort ritual. You can almost feel the collective psychology. If we can manage the smell, we can manage the fear. But smell is not just discussed here, it's a theory. Miasma thinking has trained Londoners to interpret foul air as a health threat. So each breath by the river isn't simply unpleasant. It feels risky, like participating in something you shouldn't. Which means the great stink spreads through the city like a rumor you inhale. And here's where it gets complicated. Because while the smell is real and the fear is real, the link between odour and specific diseases is not straightforward in the way many Victorians assume. That creates a dangerous situation. The city is pushed toward action by the stench, but the stench pushes it toward the wrong target if the goal is purely clean air. So London's responses begin to split into two competing instincts: deodorize and endure, treat symptoms, preserve routine, protect respectability, rebuild and relocate, treat causes, accept disruption, spend money, centralize authority. Crisis forces a decision, but it doesn't tell you which decision is wise. And that's why this summer is so important. It doesn't just create urgency. It reveals the gap between urgency and understanding. Here's what most people miss. In a city obsessed with respectability, admitting the river is a sewer isn't merely a technical problem. It's a humiliation. And humiliation is one of the fastest fuels for political change. If you've ever watched a public institution face a slow-moving scandal, say a transit system with years of ignored maintenance, there's a familiar phase before the overhaul, not the collapse. The phase before. The phase where everyone keeps commuting, smiling tightly, pretending the delays are unfortunate, while the entire city builds a second set of habits to survive what the official story won't name. That's London in early summer, 1858. The unofficial city adapting faster than the official one can speak. We're anchored now in June 1858, heading into July, when the Great Stink becomes most notorious. Key location: the stretch of the Thames beside the Palace of Westminster, where governance is forced to share air with its consequences. And the concrete reality: the city's sewage is entering the river in huge volume, and the heat makes the outcome unavoidable. Sources from the period describe defensive measures, curtains, cloths, disinfectants, attempts to turn architecture into a filter. Those measures matter because they show something profound. When infrastructure fails, people try to replace it with ritual, and rituals have limits. Quick pause, because I'm curious how you're experiencing this. As you're listening, what feels more unsettling, the stink itself, or how long the city treats it as normal? If you want, drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and they shape which hidden angles I dig into in future long documentaries. And that's when everything changes, because once the public mood flips from endurance to outrage, the story stops being local discomfort and becomes national theatre. And in 1858, theatre is something London understands very well. This is the moment where private suffering becomes public language. Newspapers thrive on moments like this, not because they invent the crisis, but because they translate it into a story people can repeat. Who's responsible? Who's embarrassed? What does it say about the nation? Why hasn't anyone fixed it? The Great Sting becomes a kind of civic mirror held up to the Capitol. And once it's a story, it's no longer just sensory, it's political. Because a smell can be shrugged off in a single room. A smell that becomes a headline is harder to contain. Because endurance was a civic habit and postponement was a governing habit. From inside London's logic, tolerating the river had always seemed like the least disruptive option. The city had survived worse winters, worse fires, worse panics. Major works were expensive and risky. Responsibility was scattered across districts and boards. Many believed the greatest danger was the air itself. so managing odour felt like managing risk. In that worldview, the Thames was unpleasant, but functional. The summer of 1858 reveals what functional really means. It means the cost is being paid somewhere else, until it isn't. So here's the setup. It's June 1858, and heat turns years of sewage pollution into an immediate sensory siege. London improvises. Routes change, windows close, cloths and disinfectants appear. Fear grows because smell is widely believed to carry disease. The press and public mood begin to harden, and the crisis transforms from private endurance into political embarrassment. Next, we go deeper into the great stink at full strength. In section 9, we'll follow a day when the city's defences stop feeling clever and start feeling desperate. When London breathes through cloth, when Parliament tries to work beside a river it can't ignore, and when the line between public nuisance and national emergency finally snaps. Because once a society's basic air becomes contested, every argument becomes personal. In London, summer usually means open windows, late light, a little mercy. But in July 1858, opening a window near the Thames feels like inviting an enemy inside, and the enemy doesn't need permission. It's July 1858, and you're walking along the river near Westminster. The sun is bright, almost insulting. The stone embankment doesn't exist yet in its later form, so the river's edge feels raw, exposed, like the city has left its seam unstitched. Heat presses down on everything. Wool coats, horse harnesses, human tempers. The air has weight. And then there's the smell, stronger now, not just present, but pervasive. It clings. It seems to occupy space. You pass a man who has tied a cloth across his mouth and knows it's not a costume. It's not melodrama. It's a practical choice made without ceremony. Outside a public building, you see heavy curtains over windows, curtains that look less like decoration and more like barricades. Someone has soaked fabric in chemicals, and the sharp, bleaching scent mixes with the river's sourness into something that feels like desperation disguised as hygiene. Now picture this. You step inside a corridor where officials move quickly, shoulders slightly raised, faces controlled. They speak in low voices, as if loudness might stir the air. The absurdity is almost comic, almost, because this is the center of an empire, and it's being defeated by atmosphere. And here's what most people miss. The Great Stink is a sensory crisis that forces a psychological confession. It makes everyone, rich, poor, official, labourer, admit with their bodies what they've avoided admitting with policy. But here's the unsettling part. The Great Stink isn't only bad smell. It's a collision of belief and embarrassment. Because if miasma is true, then this isn't merely unpleasant. It's a threat hovering over the nation's decision makers. By midsummer, the Thames is under strain. Low water levels mean less dilution. Heat speeds up decay and intensifies odour. The city continues depositing waste daily. Tides reveal mud and debris, turning the riverbank into a display case. And London is not a city that can escape itself. Even if you live far from the Thames, the city's commerce, politics and transport systems orbit the river. It's central, so the Great Stink becomes a shared context, like fog, but moral, like smoke, but personal. This is when newspapers seize the moment and public conversation changes tone. Nuisance starts to sound like insult. Inconvenience starts to sound like denial. When a crisis becomes a story, it becomes portable. And once portable, it becomes politically contagious. Now, picture this. The smell becomes part of how you judge competence. Not abstract competence, felt competence. Can the people in charge protect the city from its own output? And if they can't, what else can't they do? And here's where it gets complicated. Because the great stink pressures Parliament to act, but it doesn't automatically clarify what kind of action is correct. If you believe miasma is the mechanism, you might focus on deodorizing the river, treating its surface, masking odor, purifying air. If you focus on waterborne contamination, you might prioritize isolating drinking water sources, intercepting sewage, building systems that keep waste separate from supply. And in 1858, London is still living in both worlds at once. So you see responses that are part theatre, part necessity. Chemicals used near the river and buildings, disinfectants and curtains, public statements and debates, and, quietly, urgently, moves toward engineering decisions that will reshape the city. The Great Stink is a pivot point, where the visible problem, smell, pushes toward a solution, sewers, whose true public health benefits will be recognized more fully later. In other words, London might fix the system partly for the wrong reasons, and still save lives. History is messy like that. Here's what most people miss. The Great Stink isn't only a disaster. It's a negotiation between what's true, what's believed, and what's politically survivable. This is like a major tech platform suffering a public outage that exposes years of ignored infrastructure debt. Users don't care about the internal debates. They care that it doesn't work. Investors don't care about explanations. They care that the brand looks weak. Executives suddenly find money for repairs that weren't possible last quarter. The Great Stink is London's outage. The river becomes the error message, and it appears in the one place leaders cannot ignore, the seat of government. Anchors we can hold to. July 1858, as the peak period commonly associated with the worst stench. The Palace of Westminster as the symbolic and literal pressure point. Defensive measures. Curtains and cloths treated with disinfectants, chloride of lime often mentioned in accounts, attempts to create a breathable interior. And beneath that, the institutional anchor, legislation in 1858 enabling major works, with the Metropolitan Board of Works poised to implement a large-scale sewer system. What we're hearing in this section is the moment the abstract becomes bodily. The city's failure is no longer a line item. It's in the air. And that's when everything changes. Because once the elite experience the crisis physically, the question isn't, should we act? It becomes, how fast can we act without looking like we've panicked? Watch how institutions behave when they are cornered. They want to act, but they also want to appear as if the action was always planned, always rational, always under control. This is where official language becomes careful. Not, we ignored this, but we have long recognized the need. Not, we're desperate, but we are undertaking necessary improvements. Not, we're afraid, but we are addressing a public nuisance. Because authority, especially Victorian authority, has to look composed. Power doesn't like to admit it was forced, but the river is forcing it, because belief lives in the body. If you are taught that bad air makes you sick, and you are surrounded by bad air, you will interpret action against smell as action against death. And if you are a politician whose legitimacy depends on appearing competent, you'll interpret the smell as a political toxin. It undermines the image of London as modern. It turns Parliament into a laughingstock. It invites criticism from press and public. It suggests the state can't manage its own capital. So, action makes sense as both health policy and prestige defense. In 1858, those two motives overlap so perfectly that the city can move at last. So here's Section 9. By July 1858, heat and low water make the Thames's pollution unavoidable. London adapts with cloths, disinfectants, and closed windows. Ritual defenses against a sensory siege. Miasma belief intensifies fear, while political embarrassment intensifies urgency. The stink becomes a public story, and Parliament, cornered, moves toward the engineering solutions it resisted for years. But now the story sharpens, because once the city is unified by discomfort, it starts looking for someone to blame. And it starts asking who gets protected and who gets sacrificed. In Section 10, we'll follow the great stink into the newspapers and the streets, how public outrage is manufactured, how moral judgment gets layered onto sewage, and how London begins to turn a sanitation crisis into a struggle over class, responsibility, and the right to breathe. In 1858, London doesn't just smell the crisis, it reads it. And once the stink is printed in ink, it stops being a private misery. It becomes a public weapon. It's July 1858, and you're standing near a newspaper stall as the day's papers arrive like fresh ammunition. You can feel the heat even in the shade. Air that doesn't cool, just pauses. The street is loud. Carts, foot traffic, vendors bargaining with the seriousness of survival. And threaded through it is the one topic nobody can escape. Because it's not just a topic, it's in everyone's nose. A newsboy barks a headline, voice pitched for maximum reach. People turn their heads, coins flash, paper changes hands. Now picture this. You watch someone open the paper with the careful excitement of a person about to be confirmed. Not informed, confirmed. The story is already in their body. The paper gives it language. A man laughs once, sharp, humorless, then folds the page like he's folding a judgment. A woman skims quickly, eyes tightening as if each sentence makes the air heavier. And here's what most people miss. The great stink isn't only a sanitation crisis, it's an attention crisis. The city's disgust becomes a shared emotional market, bought, sold, and amplified. But here's the unsettling part. The press isn't inventing the stink, it's doing something more powerful, deciding what the stink means. By the mid-19th century, London is a city of print. Newspapers are not just information, they're a daily ritual, a civic mirror, a public argument you can hold in your hands. And when a city faces something hard to measure, something sensory, humiliating, and everywhere, print becomes a kind of crowd mind. It standardizes the experience. It names the villain. It identifies the embarrassed. It points to failures. It suggests solutions. It supplies outrage when outrage is useful. Because outrage is energy. And energy moves politics. If the stink stays a private suffering, it remains manageable. If the stink becomes a national joke, it becomes dangerous to ignore. Now picture this. London is the imperial capital. Its image matters. At home, abroad, and in the minds of the people paying taxes. A capital that reeks feels like a cracked crown. So the press doesn't treat the great stink as a mere nuisance. It treats it as a story about competence, about modernity, about whether the system can protect the public from itself. And that's when everything changes, because the question stops being how bad is it and becomes who allowed it. And here's where it gets complicated. Because once blame enters the room, it rarely stays fair. The Great Stink invites a familiar set of targets: landlords who neglect maintenance, local authorities accused of laziness, engineers accused of arrogance, politicians accused of delay. But it also invites another, darker habit: blaming the people who suffer most. In a city shaped by class, disgust easily becomes moral judgment. The language of filth slides from sewage to neighborhoods, from infrastructure to families, from systems to supposed character. And when that happens, reform can become punitive. Not build better sewers, but clean up those people. Not invest in housing, but control the unruly. Not fix the system, but discipline the symptom. This is the danger of crisis coverage. It can illuminate failures, or it can harden stereotypes into policy. Here's what most people miss. A stink is democratic in the short term, but the solutions are almost never democratic. Outrage in London isn't only emotion, it becomes currency. Newspapers compete for attention. Writers sharpen metaphors. Public conversation escalates. Satire circulates. Disgust becomes entertainment. Not because people are cruel, but because humor is how societies metabolize embarrassment. And there's a psychological mechanism at work. If you can laugh at the stink, you can momentarily feel above it. If you can blame someone for the stink, you can feel in control of it. If you can demand action loudly enough, you can feel like breath itself is political power. So the Great Stink becomes a civic performance. The public performs outrage, the press performs indignation, Parliament performs urgency, and everyone performs a kind of shared incredulity. As if this catastrophe is new, sudden, shocking, even though the river has been collecting the city for years. This is the Victorian equivalent of a viral PR disaster, when a company's long-ignored problem suddenly becomes a trending story. For months, insiders have known, engineers have warned, small fixes have been attempted, but once it's everywhere, once it's memeable, headlineable, repeatable, the crisis becomes less about the technical issue and more about the public meaning. Can we trust you? Were you asleep? Are you lying? London's brand is on the line, and the brand is the empire's capital. Anchors to hold. July 1858, the height of the Great Stink's notoriety. The Palace of Westminster as both symbol and casualty. Government trying to operate beside the river. The presence of defensive measures, curtains, cloths, disinfectants, widely referenced as part of how officials and residents attempted to cope. And crucially, by this point, Parliament is not merely discussing sanitation as a distant reform. It is being pushed toward legislation and funding that enables the Metropolitan Board of Works to proceed with major sewage works. In other words, this is not only conversation, it's a hinge moment where public mood helps pry open the treasury. But here's the unsettling part. When governments move fast, it's rarely because they discovered new compassion. It's because they discovered new risk. Because the press offered a story that matched what people felt. And because people needed a story that matched what they felt. The air was unbearable. The river was shameful. The heat made daily life harder. And miasma thinking made the stink feel like danger, not inconvenience. So it made sense, to treat this as a national emergency. It also made sense, politically, to dramatize it, because dramatization creates unity. It turns scattered irritation into shared outrage, and shared outrage into permission for expensive action. And to many Victorians, especially those closest to power, this framing solved a psychological problem. It allowed them to act decisively without admitting they had tolerated the intolerable for years. Next, we go to the fault line the stink exposes most brutally: class. Because once London agrees the air is unacceptable, the next question is terrifyingly practical. Who gets clean air first? Who gets moved, blamed, ignored, or improved out of existence? In section 11, we'll follow the great stink into the social hierarchy, into the politics of disgust, and watch how a sanitation crisis becomes a struggle over whose suffering counts as a crisis at all. In a city built on hierarchy, even disgust has a social ladder. Some smells are called unfortunate, others are called evidence. And in 1858, the stink forces London to reveal a brutal truth. Not everyone's air counts the same. It's 1858, and you're moving through two neighborhoods in the same afternoon, like changing worlds without leaving the city. First, a wealthier street, cleaner stone, wider space, a kind of order that feels enforced by money. Houses stand back from the road. Windows have curtains that are choices, not defenses. Servants move with practiced quiet. The smell here is present in the city's background, but softer, diluted by distance and privilege. Now picture this. You turn into a narrower set of streets, courts and alleys where buildings press close, where light arrives in thin strips, where the air feels used up before you've even breathed it. The sound changes, more voices, closer, more footsteps, the scrape of work everywhere. You see a drain running along a gutter. You see standing water in a shallow depression. You see people doing what people always do in crowded places: adapting, improvising, surviving. A child carries a pail with careful concentration. A woman shakes a cloth out a window. A man steps around a puddle with an expression that isn't disgust so much as resignation. And here's what most people miss. The stink is not only a river problem, it's an inequality amplifier. It makes existing differences in space, water, and authority impossible to ignore, unless you're the kind of person who can afford ignorance. But here's the unsettling part. Victorian London doesn't just suffer filth, it interprets filth like a moral text. And who gets to interpret it is power. In mid-19th century Britain, cleanliness isn't just hygiene, it's virtue. It signals discipline, restraint, respectability, qualities the middle and upper classes prize because they justify social order. So filth becomes more than a material condition. It becomes a label, and labels do work. If a neighborhood is described as filthy, it can be treated as dangerous, morally suspect, politically expendable, in need of control rather than investment. This is how sanitary language merges with social control. Reformers, some deeply compassionate, others intensely judgmental, often talk about improving the poor, but improvement can mean two very different things. Improving conditions, better water, housing, drainage. Improving people, discipline, surveillance, forced order. The Great Stink accelerates this tension because it makes the poor districts feel like an existential threat to the whole city, especially through the lens of miasma. If bad air causes disease, then those who live in the worst air become, in the public imagination, sources of danger. That's not science. That's social fear dressed as science. Now picture this. The smell becomes a reason to look at poverty not as suffering to relieve, but as a hazard to manage. And here's where it gets complicated. Because there's truth embedded in the fear, even if the interpretation is skewed. Overcrowded housing does amplify illness. Lack of clean water does create risk. Inadequate waste removal does spread disease, even if not always by bad air. So when Victorians connect filth and sickness, they aren't hallucinating. They're observing correlation. The complication is what they do with it. They often treat the correlation as a moral verdict. Those people live badly, therefore they are dangerous, instead of those people are forced into bad conditions, therefore the system is dangerous. It's a subtle shift that changes everything, because the first conclusion leads to policing, the second leads to infrastructure and rights. And a society chooses between those conclusions based on what it already wants to believe. Here's what most people miss. Class isn't just money here. It's ventilation, it's distance, it's the ability to close a window and still have another room. In many of London's poorest districts, families live with limited space and limited control over the environment. You can't move away from the smell if you're paying rent for one room and your livelihood is nearby. You can't choose a different water source if the nearest source is what you can reach. You can't avoid disease if disease is embedded in the city's design. So the great stink, the thing that finally reaches elite lungs, has been part of working class London's background for a long time in different forms. Smells from drains, waste disposal, crowding, and industry. This is why the moral outrage of 1858 can feel from below like hypocrisy. Now it's a crisis because it reached you. That doesn't make the crisis less real. It makes it morally complicated. Think of modern cities during an environmental crisis. Smoke from wildfires, polluted air, contaminated water. Where wealthier neighborhoods buy air purifiers, leave town, work from home, and insulate themselves. Meanwhile, the people who can't leave, service workers, delivery drivers, families in crowded housing, are told to take precautions in environments where precautions are expensive. The crisis is shared in headlines, but it's not shared in lungs. Victorian London is doing a 19th century version of that. Except the air purifier is space, and space is the most unequal product in the city. Anchors we can hold on to. 1848. The Public Health Act shapes the era's reform energy and administrative frameworks, even if unevenly applied. 1855. The Metropolitan Border Works forms, giving London a mechanism for coordinated infrastructure decisions. 1858. The Great Stink forces sewage and sanitation into urgent legislative action. But alongside infrastructure, there's the machinery of inspection and control. Local boards and inspectors often frame problems in terms of nuisances. Nuisance is a legal and administrative concept that can trigger enforcement. Orders to clean, to remove refuse, to address foul conditions. The language sounds neutral, but it lands unevenly. Because if you are poor, nuisance can mean harassment and punishment. If you are wealthy, nuisance can mean inconvenience and repair. Same word, different world. And this matters for the story ahead. Building sewers isn't just an engineering challenge. It's a redistribution of who has to live next to waste and who gets to stop living next to it. And that's when everything changes. Because once the city decides to solve sewage, it must decide where sewage goes. And wherever it goes, someone lives there. Because the dominant moral language of the era framed social order as fragile. Many Victorians believed poverty wasn't only an economic condition, it was a moral risk, a breeding ground for disorder. Add epidemic fear and miasma belief, and it becomes easy, almost automatic, to treat poor districts as dangerous zones. From inside that worldview, it makes sense to inspect aggressively, regulate behavior, clean up neighborhoods in ways that sometimes displace people, emphasize respectability as a cure. It feels like protecting the city. What they often missed, or chose not to see, is that the city's danger wasn't only in the behavior of the poor. It was in the structural design that put millions of people into close quarters with inadequate water and waste systems. In other words, it made sense to them because it preserved the social story they already depended on. So Section 11, The Great Stink, exposes class as an environmental reality. Cleanliness operates as moral performance, and filth becomes a label used to judge and control as much as to improve conditions. Overcrowding and poor infrastructure create real risk, but the interpretation often shifts blame onto the poor rather than onto systems. As London moves towards solving sewage, it faces an unspoken question. Whose neighborhoods will bear the burden of where waste is sent? Now, we're ready to meet the quiet figure at the center of London's escape route. Someone who doesn't solve the crisis with speeches, but with geometry, brick, and stubborn patience. In Section 12, we enter the mind and work of Joseph Bazalgette, and we'll ask what it means when an engineer becomes the most important political actor in the city. Because the next chapter isn't about smell, it's about the hardest kind of power, the power to redesign reality. The Great Stink forces Parliament to move, but Parliament doesn't build sewers. A different kind of person does. Someone whose power is measured not in speeches, but in gradients, brick, and time. It's 1858, and you're not in a chamber of debate. You're in a room where the air smells of paper, ink, and the faint mineral bite of construction dust carried in on coats. On a table, maps of London, wide and dense, the river cutting through like a wound that won't close. There are plans with fine lines, so fine they look fragile, like the city could refuse to obey them. You watch an engineer's hand move deliberately, no flourish, no drama, just the calm precision of someone who knows that if the numbers are wrong, the city pays. Outside, through a window, you can hear the far-off city. Carts, iron, footsteps, and the constant undertone of the Thames, an old sound that had begun to feel newly threatening. Now picture this. A man, Joseph Bazalgette, stands over the plans, not as a celebrity, not as a hero in his own time in the way we might imagine, but as a professional under pressure. He's not trying to win an argument. He's trying to make something that will still work when politics changes, when budgets tighten, when future generations forget why it was built. And here's what most people miss. This is the point where a public crisis stops being a headline and becomes a geometry problem. One solved by people whose names history often learns only after the danger has passed. But here's the unsettling part. An engineer doesn't just design pipes. He designs who has to deal with the consequences and where those consequences will go. Joseph Bazalgette is the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, the body created in 1855 to coordinate major infrastructure across London. That date matters because it means the Great Stink doesn't create the idea of action from nothing. It ignites a system that was already forming, slowly, imperfectly, under the weight of earlier epidemics and civic pressure. Bazalgette is working in an era when engineering is becoming something like modern statecraft, the ability to shape public life through hidden systems. And he's doing it in a city where governance is fragmented, public trust is shaky, and every expensive decision becomes a moral referendum. So his role is not simply technical. He has to navigate budgets, land acquisition, political scrutiny, public impatience, and the sheer physical reality of building massive works under one of the busiest cities in the world. In other words, Bazalgette is solving not one problem, but a problem nested inside many other problems. Now picture this. You're asked to redesign a city's hidden organs, while the city is still living, moving, eating, and arguing above your head. That's a job, and here's where it gets complicated. Because the solution London is moving toward isn't a single pipe or a simple cleanup. It's a complete rerouting of the city's waste, an attempt to intercept sewage before it hits central London's stretch of the Thames and carry it away downstream. That sounds straightforward until you realize what it requires. Miles of sewers large enough to handle a metropolis, pumping stations where gravity won't do the job, coordination across districts and property lines, construction on a scale that disrupts roads, river traffic, and neighborhoods, and, quietly, confidence that London will keep growing. If you build too small, the city outgrows the fix. If you build too big, critics accuse you of waste and arrogance. So Bazalgette has to gamble on London's future, on political endurance, and on the idea that doing the job properly is worth the immediate fury it will cause. Here's what most people is. The bravest part of this project isn't digging. It's committing to a design that assumes the city will become even larger, and building accordingly. This is where the story gets quietly psychological. Political power thrives on short cycles, speeches, votes, headlines, reputations. Engineering power thrives on long cycles, foundations, settling, maintenance, the slow proving of whether something works. Bazalgette's temperament, at least as we can infer from how the works unfold, has to be suited to long time. He's not rewarded by applause. He's rewarded by absence. The absence of sewage in the river where it shouldn't be. The absence of disease spikes tied to contamination. The absence of a city held hostage by smell. And that's a strange kind of success. It's success you can't pose with, which is why engineers are often invisible until everything fails. If you want a modern comparison, think of the difference between the CEO giving interviews during a crisis and the systems engineer quietly rebuilding the servers so the platform stops crashing. One gets attention. The other determines whether society can function the next morning. Bazalgette is the second kind of power that doesn't trend, but holds. Let's anchor what's happening in firm points. 1855. The Metropolitan Board of Works is established, creating a centralized mechanism for London-wide infrastructure. 1858. The Great Stink accelerates political will and funding for major sewer works. Bazalgette, as chief engineer, becomes the operational mind translating crisis into construction. And the core concept of the plan, at a high level, is this: build large intercepting sewers that capture sewage before it reaches central London's stretch of the Thames, then carry it eastward and discharge it farther downstream, away from the most populated and politically sensitive sections of the river. This is not a perfect solution by modern environmental standards. Moving waste downstream is not the same as treating it, but in the context of 1858 London, it is a radical transformation of urban hygiene and livability. If you're listening closely, you can hear the moral compromise embedded inside. London is deciding to save itself first and worry later about what downstream means for others. We'll confront that later. For now, we're watching the moment the city commits to the idea that the problem is structural, and the fix must be structural too. And that's when everything changes. Because once a city commits to infrastructure, it commits to a new kind of truth. You can't argue your way out of physics, because it aligned with several Victorian instincts at once. Progress. Building big works felt like modernity made tangible. Control. Intercepting sewage promised control over chaos. Respectability. Removing stink from the capital protected national pride. Pragmatism. Even if people debated miasma versus water theory, everyone could agree the river as sewer was intolerable. And importantly, the solution could be framed as engineering, not social revolution. It didn't require changing human nature. It required changing brickwork. That framing is politically powerful. It makes reform feel safe. Not safe for everyone. Again, downstream will matter. But safe enough for Parliament to fund and for the public to accept as the adult, modern answer. So here's section 12. We meet Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. The Great Stink forces the city's hand, but the solution becomes an engineering campaign. Intercepting sewers, pumping where necessary, and construction on a scale London has resisted. The crisis shifts from argument to design, and design becomes a new form of political power. Slow, stubborn, and difficult to undo. Next, we follow the money, because no sewer gets built on moral clarity alone. In section 13, we enter the world of contracts, budgets, and persuasion. How London convinces itself to spend a fortune on something most people will never see. How corruption fears and cost fears collide, and how the most political question of the Great Stink becomes brutally simple. The Great Stink makes everyone agree on one thing: something must be done. Then comes the harder question, the one that splits allies into enemies. Who pays? Because in London, even sewage has a balance sheet. It's late 1858, and you're in a room that smells of ink and damp wool. Not the smell of the Thames. This is a different kind of odour. The odour of administration. A clerk's desk is crowded with papers, estimates, plans, rates, letters. Someone is reading aloud numbers as if they were moral judgments. Outside, the city keeps moving. Inside, the future of its lungs is being debated in pounds and shillings. Now picture this. An official runs a finger down a column of figures, then pauses, not because the math is hard, but because the implications are. A big infrastructure project isn't just engineering. It's a redistribution of burden. Whose neighborhood gets dug up? Which businesses are disrupted? Which districts pay more? Who gets compensated? Who gets told it's for the public good? And here's what most people miss. The sewer system isn't only built out of brick and iron. It's built out of permission. Permission extracted from property owners, taxpayers, politicians, and the public imagination. But here's the unsettling part. London didn't lack ideas. London lacked a way to make expensive truth politically survivable. People are willing to pay for what they can see: a bridge, a monument, a palace facade, a warship. But sewers are underground, out of sight, and, if they work, unnoticed. That creates a paradox. The best sewer system is one nobody talks about, and it's hard to fund what can't produce immediate glory. So public health reform in the 1850s requires something beyond science or fear. It requires a cultural shift in what counts as real progress. The Great Stink helps force that shift because it turns the invisible into the most visible thing in the city: the atmosphere. Suddenly, what's underground is making itself felt above ground. That makes spending easier to justify. Not easy, never easy, but possible. Now picture this. The crisis becomes leverage. Not just moral leverage, but fiscal leverage. An opportunity for someone to argue, if we don't spend now, we'll pay more later. And here's where it gets complicated. Because when governments rush to fund major works, money attracts predators, real ones and imagined ones. Victorian Britain is intensely alert to the fear of corruption, patronage, waste, and incompetence. Not without reason. Public contracting is a world where profit and public good mingle uncomfortably. So the sewer project becomes a target from multiple directions. Critics worry about cost overruns. Property interests worry about disruption and compensation. Ideological opponents worry about central authority expanding. Some worry the project is solving the wrong problem: air versus water. And the Metropolitan Board of Works, still relatively new, is working under scrutiny. It has to look credible enough to handle a project that will touch nearly every part of London. This means decisions are rarely purely technical. They are performances of seriousness, detailed estimates, formal tender processes, published assurances, carefully staged confidence. Here's what most people miss. Infrastructure is often built in a fog of distrust, and the engineer has to build not only sewers, but belief. In Parliament and public debate, cost becomes more than a number. It becomes a rhetorical weapon. If you oppose the project, you emphasize expense, a monstrous sum, extravagance, reckless ambition. If you support the project, you emphasize value, reduce disease, protection of commerce, preservation of the capital's dignity, long-term savings. This is the moral vocabulary of finance. The attempt to convert public suffering into a justification that can survive in a political economy. And this is where the Great Stink's psychological power really shows. When people are uncomfortable enough, expensive starts to feel like necessary, because the alternative is breathing the consequences. Think of a city today debating whether to replace aging water pipes or reinforce flood defenses. The loudest argument against it is usually, it's too expensive. Then a disaster hits: contaminated water, collapsed infrastructure, a flood, and suddenly the money appears with surprising speed. Not because money was unavailable, but because the political cost of spending changes. London in 1858 discovers the same thing. The treasury isn't only economic, it's psychological. We can ground this in the institutional setup. The Metropolitan Board of Works, MBW, exists since 1855 to coordinate major infrastructure. In 1858, Parliament passes legislation enabling and funding major sewer works, turning long debate into actionable authority. From this point, Bazalgette's plans can move from paper to contract. This requires tendering and hiring contractors, purchasing materials, brick, iron, mortar, organizing labor, negotiating rights of way, coordinating with roads, railways, and river traffic. The sewer system is not a single line. It's a network. And networks require administration. This is where the story gains a new texture. Not just stink and fear, but logistics and compromise. Because every mile of sewer is built through 1,000 small decisions that someone has to sign. And that's when everything changes. Because once contracts are signed, the city can't undecide. The crisis has been translated into irreversible action because it offered a rare alignment of motives. Public health reformers could argue for sanitation. Politicians could argue for dignity and order. Business interests could argue for stability and uninterrupted commerce. Ordinary residents could argue for relief from the air itself. Even if these groups disagreed on disease theory, air versus water, they could agree that a capital that smelled like a sewer was not sustainable. And importantly, the sewer project could be framed as a modernization, not a redistribution of power, though it was, quietly, both. It made sense because it allowed London to protect its image, while also building something genuinely transformative. The morality of brickwork is this. It's one of the few moralities a government can enforce without asking people to become better humans. It just asks them to pay. So Section 13. The Great Stink forces urgency, but urgency must become funding. The sewer project becomes a battle of cost, distrust, ideology, and persuasion. The MBW and Parliament translate sensory crisis into contracts, making the plan real. And once it's real, London is committed to a new kind of power, infrastructure that will outlast speeches. Next, we go to the ground, literally. In Section 14, London becomes a construction site. Streets are opened, brickwork begins. The river is measured, not admired, and the city learns what it means to rebuild itself while still living inside itself. Because now the stink has done its job. It has forced London to start digging. London's solution to the Great Stink is not a speech. It's a scar. A long, deliberate cut through streets, riverbanks, and routine. Made so the city can finally stop poisoning its own breath. It's the early phase of the works, late 1850s into the 1860s, and you're standing at the edge of a trench wide enough to make you instinctively step back. The ground has been peeled open. Soil is piled like dark bread loaves along the street. Timber supports hold back collapsing edges. Men move in coordinated patterns, lift, carry, lower, like the city has hired an extra heartbeat. You smell wet earth, sweat, and mortar dust. Not the Thames, at least not right here. This is the smell of a city trying to become something else. The soundscape is relentless. Metal on stone, shouted measurements, cartwheels grinding past, the rhythm of labor that doesn't care whether today is convenient. Now picture this. A shopkeeper stands in a doorway, arms folded, watching. Not with romance. This isn't heroic to them. It's disruption. It's noise. It's customers diverted. It's mud tracked in. It's progress. Arriving like an unwanted house guest. And here's what most people miss. The sewer revolution doesn't feel like a clean, triumphant transformation while it's happening. It feels like living inside renovation, where every day is inconvenience, and the promise is always later. But here's the unsettling part. Once you start digging, the city can't pretend this is a small problem anymore. The scale becomes visible, and visibility is political. The phrase intercepting sewer sounds clinical, almost polite. But the idea is bold in a way Victorians would recognize as serious. Instead of letting waste flow into the central Thames, you build large sewers, big enough to handle a metropolis, that intercept smaller drains before they reach the river. Then you route the sewage away, eastward, toward outfalls downstream. Conceptually, London stops dumping directly beside itself and starts redirecting its own waste stream. Practically, that means coordinating a network across a city that's still working. This is the part of the story where the state learns something every modern city eventually learns. If you want invisible systems, you have to do very visible disruption first. Roads close, traffic reroutes, markets complain, property owners negotiate, people adjust their walking routes again. Only now it's because the solution has become another temporary problem. Now picture this. You're trying to build a hidden network under London while London keeps moving above it, like performing surgery on a patient who refuses to stop walking. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the project isn't just about digging lines. It's about physics and time. Sewage has to move. In many places, it moves by gravity, which means the sewers must be carefully graded. Subtle slopes over long distances. A sewer can't be roughly right. Roughly right means stagnation, blockage, flooding, and the return of everything London is trying to bury. Then there's the river itself. The Thames is tidal. Levels rise and fall. That affects how outfalls behave, how pumping stations must work, and how the whole system interacts with the water it's trying to protect, at least in central London. And then there's the social complication. The works don't affect everyone equally. Some neighborhoods become long-term construction zones. Some businesses lose foot traffic. Some residents live beside noise and mud for years. Progress has a geography. The Great Stink forced urgency. Construction forces endurance. Here's what most people miss. A sewer system is a promise that requires faith, because you can't see the improvement until the work is done. And by then, the suffering has already been paid. This is where the story slows down in the best way. Into the texture. Brick after brick after brick. It's easy to say London built sewers, as if the city simply decided and then woke up, modern. But the reality is thousands of daily acts. Bricks fired and hauled, mortar mixed, arches laid, measurements checked, mistakes corrected before they become disasters. When you're down in a trench looking at the curve of an arch, you can almost feel the mindset. This isn't meant to last a season. It's meant to last decades. And that's a psychological shift. A government that funds sewers is admitting the future exists, and that the future will judge it by what it leaves underground. If you've ever lived through a major city transit rebuild, months of closures, detours, temporary inconvenience that becomes a way of life, you know the mood. Half the city complains. The other half says it's necessary. Everyone feels exhausted by promises. And somewhere under it all, workers keep placing the next segment because the work doesn't respond to opinions. It responds to time and labor. Victorian London is doing the 19th century version of that, except the stakes include whether the capital can breathe without shame. Here are the anchors you can hold onto in this section. The Metropolitan Board of Works, formed 1855, as the coordinating authority behind the major works. The post-1858 push that turns crisis into construction. The tangible objects of the build, brick-lined sewer tunnels, intercepting routes, and, where gravity isn't enough, the need for pumping stations. And geographically, this work is tied to the river's edges and to the city's drains, because the system is built not as one straight line, but as a network designed to catch and redirect what used to spill into the Thames. Records from the era emphasize the monumental scale, miles of underground passage, large diameter tunnels, and extensive coordination, because that's what it takes to change a city at this size. And if sources disagree on exact totals in popular retellings, the broader historical consensus is clear. This was among the largest urban sanitation projects of its time. And that's when everything changes. Because once London is physically under construction, the project becomes harder to sabotage quietly. Opposition can complain, but the trenches are already open. The city has crossed the point where denial is cheap. Why did people believe this made sense at the time? Because the alternatives were finally more expensive than the fix. After 1858, doing nothing no longer looked like prudence. It looked like negligence, socially, politically, physically. And the sewer works also fit Victorian faith in engineered order. If society is messy, build systems. If the poor districts feel chaotic, impose sanitation. If the river is embarrassing, redesign the flow. Even when motives weren't pure, prestige mattered, class bias mattered. People could still genuinely believe this is what a modern capital does. It builds beneath itself. It made sense because it transformed a moral panic into a technical mission, something Parliament could fund and then point to as proof of competence. So Section 14, London becomes a construction site. Intercepting sewers aren't an abstract plan anymore. They're trenches, brick arches, disruption, and years of patient labor. The challenge isn't just political will, it's physics, scale, and endurance. And once the city is opened up, denial becomes impossible, because the solution is now literally cut into the ground. But there's a side of this story we've only brushed past: the human cost of building the future. In the next section, we go down into the work itself. The people who dug, laid, carried and risked their bodies to give London clean air and a cleaner riverfront. Because the sewer system doesn't build itself, and the people who build it rarely get the kind of history reserved for lawmakers. Section 15 is where we meet them. Every city loves to celebrate its skyline. Almost no city celebrates the people who built what's underneath. And London's escape from the Great Stink is carried, quite literally, on the backs of workers most Victorians preferred not to see. It's the late 1850s into the 1860s, and you're climbing down into a trench where the light changes as you descend. Up top, London is noise and motion. Down here, the sound becomes different, heavier, closer. Metal strikes echo. Voices bounce off timber and brick. You hear the scrape of shovels, the steady friction of rope, the quiet, constant drip of water that makes everything feel colder than it should. The air is damp. It tastes of earth and lime from mortar. Your hands brush rough timber supports. splintery and wet. You feel mud pull at your boots. Now picture this. A line of men passing bricks hand to hand rhythmically, almost like a ritual. Their clothes are stiff with grime. Their faces are focused in that way people get when the work is too hard for daydreaming. A foreman calls out instructions. Measurements matter. Angles matter. The tunnel must hold. The slope must be right. And every so often, there's a pause that you can feel more than you can hear. The kind of pause that happens when someone senses a shift in the earth, or a weakness in the support, or the sudden wrongness of silence. And here's what most people miss. The sewer system is a moral achievement only if you remember that it required ordinary people to do extraordinary, risky work in conditions that rarely made it into polite conversation. But here's the unsettling part. Victorian London loved the idea of progress. It loved far less the reality that progress was built through bodies that could be injured, exhausted, or simply replaced. C. Context expansion. Labour in a city that runs on invisible human effort. The mid-19th century is an age of massive public works and industrial growth, but the labour systems are often harsh, precarious, and unequal. Workers on projects like Bazalgette sewers are not treated as romantic pioneers. They are paid labour in an economy where job security is limited, safety standards are inconsistent, injuries can mean immediate financial disaster, and the social distance between planners and labourers is wide. This is also a time when London is crowded with people seeking work. That abundance of labour can make employers less cautious. If someone quits or is injured, someone else is available, which is the cruel logic of scale. The same growth that creates the problem also creates the workforce to solve it, at a cost distributed unevenly. Now picture this. You're building a sewer meant to prevent disease, but the work itself carries hazards. It's the paradox of reform. Harm in the making of something meant to reduce harm. And here's where it gets complicated. Because even if you avoid graphic detail, the risks of subterranean construction are obvious. Collapses, flooding, poor air in confined spaces, heavy materials, long hours in wet conditions. The very environment you're trying to tame, water, earth, waste, doesn't become gentle just because the project is for public good. And remember, London's public health worldview is still in transition. Ideas about ventilation and bad air are widely feared, and underground work can feel doubly dangerous, physically and medically, in the imagination of the time. So the workers aren't only fighting earth and water, they're fighting the city's superstition about what it means to go underground near sewage. And that has consequences. Some people are seen as brave, others are seen as tainted. Here's what most people miss. The sewer worker is not just a labourer. He becomes a boundary figure, someone who handles what society wants removed, and is therefore treated as partially removed himself. Cities depend on dirty work, waste removal, drainage, cleaning, burial, slaughtering, hauling. Victorian London, obsessed with Thew's respectability, needs these jobs desperately and also finds them embarrassing. So the people who do them become socially muted, essential but uncelebrated, present but not spoken about with admiration in most polite circles. And that social invisibility is a kind of injustice that's hard to measure. Because when you don't see people, you don't design systems around their safety or dignity. You design systems around output. The sewer works are output-driven. Miles built, bricks laid, lines completed. But each brick is also time, strain, and risk. Think of the people who keep modern cities functioning during a crisis: sanitation workers during a heat wave, utility crews during storms, delivery drivers during disruptions. Everyone calls them essential. Then the crisis passes, and they become background again. Victorian London is doing the same thing, except without the modern language of essential workers. The appreciation is muted, the protections are thinner, and the expectation of sacrifice is often taken for granted. Anchors to hold. This work expands rapidly after 1858, under the authority enabled by Parliament and coordinated by the Metropolitan Board of Works. It continues through the 1860s, requiring extensive labour and material supply. Concrete objects define the labour: brick-lined tunnels, timber supports, mortar and lime, carts hauling spoil, and, in key locations, the construction of pumping infrastructure where gravity alone cannot carry sewage. The project scale means thousands of workers over years, an army of labour without uniforms, fighting not a foreign enemy, but the city's own byproducts. And while popular retellings often focus on Bazalgette's genius, historians of infrastructure repeatedly emphasize a truth that's easy to forget. Engineering vision only becomes real through labour capacity. No labour, no sewer revolution. No sewer revolution, no escape from the great stinks logic. And that's when everything changes. Because as the works expand, they don't just create tunnels. They reshape the surface of London, roads, river edges, public spaces. Which brings us to one of the strangest twists in the story. London doesn't only build sewers, it builds beauty on top of them, because Victorians believed progress should be visible, even when its most important parts were hidden. The sewer system is functional, yes, but it's also an embarrassment management system. It helps remove the sights and smells that threaten the capital's dignity. From the era's perspective, it makes sense that the city would invest in the kind of works that reduce disease risk, even if understood imperfectly, reduce nuisance and odour, protect commerce and political stability, and restore the sense that London is a modern, governable place. And it also makes sense, within Victorian class logic, that the people who did the hardest work would receive the least narrative glory. That's how hierarchy stays intact, by treating essential labour as natural, expected, almost invisible. The system is changed. The story of who changed it is controlled. So section 15, we move into the human engine of the sewer revolution. The workers digging trenches, laying brick arches, and enduring the risks of underground construction. Their labour is essential but socially undervalued, shaped by Victorian attitudes toward dirty work. The sewer system is built through bodies and time, and as it grows, it begins to transform not only what's under London, but what London can become above it. In section 16, we follow the embankment, the stone river edge that reshapes the Thames, creates new roads and public spaces, and wraps engineering in architecture. Because the city doesn't just want the sting gone. London doesn't just fix the problem, it dresses the fix. Because nothing reassures a powerful city like turning humiliation into architecture and building a clean-looking surface over a dirty truth. It's the 1860s, and you're walking along a stretch of the Thames where the river no longer feels like it's eating the city from the inside. Stone walls hold the river in a more disciplined shape. The edge is straighter, more composed, like London has put the Thames into formal wear. You feel the texture underfoot, new paving, solid and confident. You hear the steady pulse of traffic on a newly organized roadway. The air still carries smoke and city life, but the river's old accusation, the raw, unfiltered closeness of waste, has been pushed away from this surface experience. Now picture this: people strolling, not rushing, strolling. A small miracle in a city that usually moves like a machine. You watch a carriage pass, wheels crisp on the road. You see workers still finishing stonework. You see the river flowing beside this engineered boundary, a little more like scenery again. And here's what most people miss. The embankment isn't only a public works project. It's a psychological project. It's a statement that London's relationship with its own waste can be made invisible, controlled, civilized. But here's the unsettling part. The embankment is beautiful, and beauty can be a kind of forgetting. The embankment is one of those rare projects that merges engineering, sewers, river control, transportation, roads, urban design, public space, and political symbolism, modernity made stone. At a practical level, embanking the river helps in multiple ways. It changes the shape and flow of the river edge, creates space for major routes along the Thames, and, crucially for our story, provides a corridor where key parts of the sewer system can run. It becomes, in effect, a disguised artery of sanitation, wrapped in civic grandeur. This is Victorian genius and Victorian theatre at once, because the embankment doesn't just solve problems, it tells a story. Look, we are modern, we are ordered, we can reshape nature, and by extension, we can reshape ourselves. Now picture this: the most important part of the embankment, its hidden function, stays underground. What people see is the surface, the promenade, the lamps, the sense of control. And here's where it gets complicated. Because solving sewage by intercepting it and sending it downstream is not the same as treating it. The embankment and the new sewer network greatly improve central London's air and reduce the immediate horror along the river's heart. But they also shift the burden outward, eastward, toward where the outfalls discharge. This is the moral geometry of infrastructure. The cleanest place is often clean because somewhere else becomes dirtier. Victorian London is in many ways saving the symbolic core of the empire first. That doesn't erase the achievement, but it complicates it. It forces us to ask, clean for whom and at whose expense? This isn't a modern gotcha. It's the honest shape of the decision. Here's what most people miss. Infrastructure doesn't erase waste. It organizes it into places that are easier to ignore. A modern comparison. Think of a city that revitalizes its waterfront. Cafes, promenades, luxury apartments. While the less glamorous facilities that keep the city alive, waste processing, power generation, freight corridors, are moved farther away, out of sight, out of mind. The waterfront becomes a brand. The dirty functions are relocated to the margins. The embankment is an early version of that, a public-facing masterpiece that also serves as a corridor for hidden sanitation systems. London becomes more livable and more photogenic at the same time. Anchors we can hold. The major sewer works proceed after 1858, and the embankment construction belongs largely to the 1860s era of transformation. The Metropolitan Board of Works coordinates the works, with Bazalgette's engineering shaping what goes beneath. Concrete objects and places define this section, The stone river walls, the new roadways, gas lamps and railings, and, beneath, large sewer conduits carrying waste away from central London's riverfront. This is where the city turns engineering into civic architecture. It's not just a sewer line anymore. It's a new London surface. And that's when everything changes. Because once the embankment exists, the Great Stink starts to become dangerously a story with a happy ending. And happy endings can make people stop asking hard questions. Because Victorians believed civilization meant controlling nature and controlling disorder. Whether that disorder was in rivers, streets, or populations. The embankment made sense as a practical sanitation measure, a transportation improvement, a beautification project, and a statement of national competence. It allowed London to replace the memory of humiliation with the evidence of control. And psychologically, it offered relief, not just relief from odour, but relief from shame. It helped London feel like itself again, the capital of a confident empire, not a city held hostage by its own waste. But a city's self-image is always selective. The embankment doesn't only represent progress, it represents curation, the decision about what the city will show and what it will hide. So Section 16, London turns sanitation into architecture. The embankment reshapes the river's edge, creates new roads and public spaces, and hides major sewer conduits beneath a beautiful surface. It restores dignity and livability, especially in the capital's core, while also relocating burdens downstream. The city learns to control its story by controlling what it shows. Next, we step back and ask, what actually changed and what didn't? Because the Great Stink didn't just prompt engineering. It rewired how London thought about public health, government responsibility, and what a city owes its people. In Section 17, we'll track the consequences, how disease patterns shift, how confidence returns, and how the city begins to mythologize what happened, sometimes honestly, sometimes conveniently, because the river may be contained. But memory is harder to engineer. When a city solves a crisis, it wants the solution to feel permanent, like the past has been sealed off. But cities don't erase their old selves, they build over them. And sometimes the old truth keeps leaking through the seams. B. You are there seen. The calm after the humiliation. It's the mid to late 1860s, and you're standing near the Thames again, watching London behave as if it has regained composure. The river edge looks more controlled in places. Traffic moves, people linger. The city feels less like it's flinching. You notice something subtle. Breathing is no longer a public performance. Fewer cloths pressed to faces. Fewer windows slammed shut with panic. The air isn't pure. This is still an industrial city, but the particular dread of 1858 has loosened its grip. Now picture this. You walk through a street market and realize the conversation has shifted. People still complain. Londoners will always complain. But the smell of the river is no longer the center of the city's emotional life. That's a strange kind of victory. A problem is solved when it becomes background again. And here's what most people miss. The end of a crisis often feels like forgetting. Not because people are ungrateful, but because daily life rushes back into the space fear used to occupy. But here's the unsettling part. A city can fix what it can measure and build. It struggles to fix what it believes. And belief about disease, about class, about responsibility, doesn't change as quickly as brickwork. the sewer works dramatically reduce the amount of sewage entering central London's stretch of the Thames, and the embankment projects reshape the riverfront experience. In practical terms, the capital becomes more livable. Less constant stench near the political centre, improved drainage in many areas, a stronger framework for coordinating city-scale infrastructure. And over time, London's public health environment shifts in ways that historians and public health scholars generally link to improved sanitation. Fewer conditions that allow water contamination to recur as easily, better removal of waste from dense living areas, and a redefinition of what a modern city should provide. But this is crucial. The benefits aren't instantly uniform, and they aren't purely technological. Public health improves through a combination of factors over decades: sanitation, water quality, housing changes, medical understanding, and policy evolution. So the sewer works are not a magic switch. They are a foundation. And foundations are powerful precisely because they quietly force future decisions to align with them. Now picture this. London's leaders begin to tell themselves a comforting story, that the city's problems were technical, and now they're solved. But the city's problems were never only technical. And here's where it gets complicated. Because even as central London becomes cleaner, the system creates new ethical and environmental tensions. Redirecting sewage downstream reduces stink in the core, but it concentrates waste farther east. The river is still used in effect as part of a waste management strategy, just repositioned. And there's another complication. The improvement of sewage disposal does not automatically fix overcrowded housing, poverty, labor exploitation, or the moralized stigma attached to dirty districts. A cleaner riverfront can coexist with deeply unequal living conditions inland. This is the danger of infrastructure success. It can be used as proof that the system works, while the system continues to fail people in other ways. Progress becomes a shield against criticism. Here's what most people miss. When a city builds something monumental, it often treats the monument as a certificate of virtue. But a sewer doesn't certify morality. It certifies capacity. Think of a modern company that survives a scandal by investing in a major fix. New compliance systems, new security, new public-facing reforms. The fix is real. It helps. It prevents some future disasters. But the company then uses the fix as a narrative. We're responsible now. And that narrative can become a way to stop asking whether deeper cultural problems remain. London does something similar. The sewer works become a powerful symbol of competence, and symbols can lull people into thinking the underlying tensions are resolved. One of the most sobering anchors comes later. The 1866 cholera outbreak in London. By this time, major sewer works are underway or partially complete, and the outbreak's pattern becomes part of how historians discuss the transition in understanding and infrastructure, often cited as evidence that contaminated water sources still mattered profoundly, and that improvements were uneven. In other words, cholera's persistence shows that a city can build impressive systems and still remain vulnerable where the system isn't complete, or where water supply remains compromised. This isn't failure, it's realism. It's the difference between building the backbone and having the entire body fully healed. And it reinforces a key point. Public health is not a single invention. It's a long negotiation between environment, policy, and knowledge. And that's when everything changes. because once the crisis has passed, London begins to decide what the Great Stink was, retroactively. Was it a shameful episode, a heroic triumph, a comedy of errors, a founding myth? How you answer that determines what you learn, because after surviving a crisis, people need meaning. It's psychologically difficult to accept that a city endured years of misery and danger simply because incentives and fragmentation prevented action. That story feels too bleak, too implicating. So it makes sense that London would prefer a narrative like, "We faced an extraordinary event. We rose to the challenge. We built modern infrastructure. We became better." There's truth there. There's also selective memory, and selective memory is how societies protect their self-image. The Great Stink becomes gradually a story that flatters the city, a tale of decisive Victorian improvement, rather than a tale of delayed responsibility and unequal suffering. So Section 17. The sewer works. An embankment transforms central London's relationship with the Thames. Less stink, more control, a foundation for modern sanitation. But the benefits are uneven, burdens shift downstream, and deeper social inequalities persist. Later events, including the 1866 cholera outbreak, remind the city that infrastructure is foundational, not magical. And as relief sets in, London begins to reshape the memory of the crisis into a story it can live with. Next, we confront that memory directly. In Section 18, we'll ask, what parts of the Great Stink story are true, and what parts are the kind of myth societies build when they want progress to feel clean? Because the stink wasn't just an event. It's an origin story, and origin stories always have something they're trying to hide. Every city wants a clean turning point, a moment you can point to and say, that's when we became modern. But history rarely gives us clean turning points. It gives us messy ones we later polish until they shine. It's not 1858 anymore. It's later. Late Victorian London, the kind of time when people begin telling the story of 1858 with a little more confidence than accuracy. You're in a lecture hall or a reading room, listening to someone describe the Great Stink as a dramatic turning point. Parliament overwhelmed, heroic engineers, swift action, salvation through science. The room smells of paper and dust. The tone is proud, almost relieved. Now picture this. You step outside and walk along the embankment. It's solid. It's beautiful. It feels inevitable, like it always belonged here. And that's how myth works. It makes what was fought over feel like destiny. And here's what most people miss. When a city builds a magnificent solution, it often rewrites the crisis as a simple before and after story, because simple stories are easier to teach, easier to repeat, and easier to use as proof of national competence. But here's the unsettling part. A neat origin story can hide the parts that matter most. The years of delay, the unequal suffering, the inconvenient evidence, and the uncomfortable compromises. And that is exactly the point. It wants to look like it was always in control. Now the question becomes, how do you build a hidden city under a city without breaking the one above it? Because confidence is how you keep money flowing. The popular Great Stink story often gets told like this. London smells terrible. Parliament panics. Bazalgette builds sewers. London is saved. That isn't wrong in outline, but it's incomplete in a way that changes the meaning, because the Great Stink is not the beginning of London's sanitation debate. It's the moment that debate becomes unavoidable for the people with the power to fund large-scale action. And Bazalgette doesn't build a system in a single burst of genius. He builds within an institutional context, the MBW, in a world of contracts, politics, and years of labor. And the crisis doesn't instantly produce correct scientific understanding. The sewer works help enormously, but public health knowledge evolves gradually. Victorians often act for mixed reasons: fear of smell, fear of disease, fear of embarrassment, belief in progress. Myth turns mixed motives into pure ones. Reality is more human. Now picture this: a society that wants to believe it reformed because it was wise, not because it was cornered. That desire shapes how the Great Stink is remembered. And here's where it gets complicated. Because myths aren't always lies. They're often compressed truths. The Great Stink did catalyze political action. Bazalgette's engineering was extraordinary. The sewer works did transform London. The myth becomes dangerous only when it's used to hide uncomfortable lessons. That years of suffering were tolerated before elites were personally affected. That belief, miasma, drove urgent action even as evidence about water spread unevenly. That sewage was redirected rather than solved in a modern environmental sense. That the workers who built the system remained socially invisible, and that class shaped who suffered most before the turning point arrived. A myth becomes a problem when it turns a warning into a comfort. Here's what most people miss. The Great Stink isn't just a sanitation story. It's a story about how societies manage responsibility, especially responsibility they'd rather not claim. Consider how often we lean on the Broad Street pump handle story as a neat emblem. Remove the handle, stop the outbreak, science wins. It's a powerful symbol. It's also an example of how history becomes digestible. Because complex systems are hard to narrate, symbols are easy. A pump handle is a prop you can hold in your mind. A fragmented water network, competing theories, uneven enforcement, and long-term infrastructure finance. Those are harder. So the Great Stink story often gets told with props. The stench at Parliament, the disinfectant-soaked curtains, the heroic engineer, the decisive act. Props aren't false, they're incomplete. They become myth when they replace the system. This is like how companies write case studies after a crisis. A sleek timeline, a clear lesson learned, a confident statement about transformation. The timeline is real. The lesson is often real. But what's missing is the messy middle. The arguments, the incentives, the moments people tried to delay, and the ways responsibility shifted around the room like a hot object no one wanted to hold. London's Great Stink becomes a civic case study, a polished narrative the city can show itself. Here's what we can anchor with confidence in the structure of the story. The Great Stink's most notorious period is the summer of 1858, especially June and July. The Metropolitan Board of Works, created 1855, provides an institutional mechanism for large-scale works. Bazalgette's sewer plan focuses on intercepting sewage and carrying it away from central London, beginning a transformation that plays out through the 1860s. And here's where historians sometimes debate emphasis. Exactly how quickly certain beliefs shifted in public health circles, how decisive specific moments were, like the pump handle, and how to measure the Great Stink's role relative to longer-term reform movements already underway. The broad consensus is not in doubt. This was a pivotal episode in London's sanitary history. But pivotal doesn't mean simple. And that's when everything changes. Because once a city believes it has a heroic origin story, it can start using it as proof that it will always fix problems when they become serious, which is a comforting belief and a dangerous one. Because myth is functional. It helps societies restore pride after humiliation, justify massive spending after the fact, frame disruption and hardship as meaningful, and present progress as inevitable rather than contested. For Victorians, the Great Stink origin story also reinforced a national self-image. Britain as rational, modern, capable of mastering nature through science and engineering. That's not entirely false, but it's selective. It makes sense because it turns a messy civic failure into a narrative of competence. And competence is one of the most valuable resources any state can claim. So Section 18. The Great Stink becomes an origin story, a neat before and after myth. That's not wrong, but incomplete. Myth compresses mixed motives into pure progress and hides the years of delay, the unequal suffering, and the moral compromise of moving waste downstream. Symbols like the pump handle and Parliament's discomfort become props that help people remember, but can also distract from the deeper system. Next, we bring the story forward. In Section 19, we look at the modern world through the Great Stink's lens. How cities today manage infrastructure debt, environmental crises and PR, and how often we repeat the same pattern. Delay until discomfort becomes unavoidable. Because the Great Stink isn't just Victorian history, it's a template. And once you see the template, you start noticing it everywhere. The Great Stink feels like a Victorian problem until you realize what it really is. A story about infrastructure you don't notice, until it fails loudly enough to embarrass the people in charge. You're not in 1858 now. You're in a modern city, any modern city, standing on a clean-looking street that hides a complicated underworld. You hear traffic, the soft hiss of buses, the hum of air conditioning. You see glass buildings and signage and the choreography of normal life. And then something shifts. A warning issued, a boil water notice, a sewage overflow after heavy rain, a subway line shut down, a river suddenly declared unsafe. The tone of the city changes in a day. People start doing the same things Londoners did in 1858, changing routes, improvising defences, swapping rumours, searching for someone to blame, demanding action from institutions that move slowly until they move all at once. Now picture this. A press conference. Officials in clean shirts. Carefully chosen words. The language of reassurance. We take this seriously. We're working around the clock. We've activated a response plan. And here's what most people miss. Modernity hasn't eliminated the Great Stink pattern. It has refined it. Our crises are often quieter until they're suddenly trending. But here's the unsettling part. Most infrastructure collapses aren't surprises to the people inside the system. They're surprises to the public because the system is designed to keep its weaknesses invisible. The Great Stink teaches a lesson that remains painfully current. Invisible systems compete poorly for attention and money. Politicians get rewarded for visible wins. New buildings, new programs, announcements. Infrastructure maintenance is slow, technical, and hard to glamorize. So cities accumulate what we might call infrastructure debt. The gap between what a system needs and what it receives. It's not always negligence. Sometimes it's triage. But it creates a pattern. Delay repairs, manage symptoms, rely on good enough, hope nothing extreme happens, then act rapidly when a crisis breaks the seal. This is exactly how London drifted toward 1858. And the psychology is the same. If a problem is tolerable, people adapt. If people adapt, leaders interpret adaptation as acceptance. If leaders interpret acceptance as stability, they delay. Until summer, literal or metaphorical, makes the mistake speak. And here's where it gets complicated. Because modern crises come with more data and more science, yet misinformation and belief still shape response. In 1858, miasma theory gives people a simple explanation that matches sensation. Today, different simplified stories play similar roles. Single cause explanations for complex failures, moral blame placed on individuals instead of systems, bad actors narratives that distract from design flaws. And modern institutions still perform authority. You can hear it in the language of crisis management. An isolated incident, a limited number of affected areas, no ongoing risk, out of an abundance of caution. Sometimes those statements are true. Sometimes they're tactics, ways of controlling fear while systems catch up. The Great Stink reminds us that authority doesn't only solve problems, it also manages the appearance of solving them. Here's what most people miss. In every era, the public wants the same thing in a crisis. Not just safety, but the feeling that someone is in control. And when that feeling cracks, the response becomes political, fast. Think of a major brand facing a product failure. The company can either admit a structural problem, expensive, reputation shaking, or frame it as a small anomaly, cheap, controllable, not reflective of our standards. Cities do a version of the same thing with infrastructure. They prefer the anomaly story. Until the failure becomes sensory in public, until it floods a street, contaminates water, or turns a river into an embarrassment. Then the city finds money, urgency, and resolve, just as London did in 1858. Let's tie it back. 1858 is a classic case where a long-known infrastructure problem becomes politically irresistible due to a highly visible sensory crisis. The response involves creating or empowering centralized mechanisms, like the Metropolitan Board of Works, and funding large-scale engineering solutions, Bazalgette's intercepting sewers and related works. Those structural features, visibility, embarrassment, centralized authority, massive spending, recur again and again in modern crises. The Great Stink isn't just a weird Victorian episode. It's a model of how cities change when denial stops being comfortable. And that's when everything changes. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And then Section 20 has one last question to ask. What does it mean that we keep needing a great stink moment before we act? Because the logic of delay is always seductive. We have more urgent priorities. The system is working well enough. A major overhaul is too disruptive. We can't justify the cost right now. We'll address it in the next budget cycle. Those statements can be rational in the short term. They become irrational in the long term. Victorian London believed delay made sense because the river had carried the city's waste away for generations, until it didn't. Modern cities believe delay makes sense because systems often work quietly for decades, until they don't. The Great Stink reminds us, a system can function and still be failing, right up until it becomes undeniable. We bring the Great Stink forward as a template for modern infrastructure crises. Invisibility breeds delay, delay accumulates debt, and action often comes when failure becomes public and embarrassing. Belief and simplified narratives still shape response, and authority still performs control. The Victorian story isn't distant, it's familiar. In the final section, we return to the river, not just as water, but as memory, because the Thames didn't stop being a river with a past just because London built stone walls and underground conduits. In section 20, we'll ask what the Great Stink left behind in the city's psyche, how it reshaped what London thinks government is for, how it taught the world what a modern city can do, and why, if we're honest, cities still prefer to hide their mistakes until something forces them to speak. At midnight, a river doesn't care about your speeches. It doesn't care about your empire. It carries what you give it until it can't. And the Thames, even after 1858, carries memory like sediment. It's later, late Victorian London, edging toward the modern world, and you're standing near the Thames on a night when the city's noise softens into a low hum. Gas lamps flicker along the river walk. Light pools on stone and then dissolves into darkness. The air is cooler now, and the river's presence feels calmer, less accusatory. You lean on the railing and listen. Water moves with the old patience it has always had. Boats pass. Footsteps approach and fade. Somewhere behind you, the city lives. Shops closing, carriage wheels, laughter drifting from a doorway. And you realize something strange. The Great Stink is gone as an atmosphere, but it remains as an idea. The river has been disciplined, but the city learned the lesson it can't fully unlearn. What you hide underground can still shape life above it. Now picture this. A passerby looks at the water without thinking about sewage, without thinking about cholera, without thinking about handkerchiefs and disinfectant curtains. That's success in a way. But it's also risk, because forgetting is how the conditions for the next crisis are quietly rebuilt. But here's the unsettling part. The Great Stink didn't just change pipes. It changed what London believed a government is for. See, context expansion. What the Great Stink leaves behind. If you strip the story down to its bones, 1858 becomes a pivot in modern urban life. Before, public health is partially moralized, partially local, partially improvised. After, the city increasingly accepts that health is engineerable, that government can and should build systems that reduce collective risk. The Great Stink strengthens a new civic expectation, that the state is responsible not only for laws and wars, but for the invisible conditions that make life survivable: water, waste, streets, air. That expectation doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't erase inequality, but it becomes part of what modern city means. And London's model influences how other cities think about sanitation, not as personal virtue, but as public design. This is one of those moments when a humiliating crisis becomes a blueprint. Now picture this: Aggie, politicians standing at a podium, promising progress, while beneath their feet, literally, progress is a tunnel built by workers nobody named in the speech. That's the modern world in embryo. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the Great Stink's legacy is not purely celebratory. Yes, it pushed London toward large-scale sanitation that improved life dramatically. But it also taught a more ambiguous lesson: that a city can solve problems by relocating them. Intercepting sewers clean the capital's core by sending waste downstream. The river remains part of the waste story, just in a way that is less politically embarrassing to Westminster. This is the compromise embedded in so much infrastructure history. The improvement is real, and the costs are real, and the costs are often placed where they're easiest to ignore. So the river remembers not only salvation, but displacement. And that's why the Great Stink matters beyond Victorian trivia. It's a case study in how progress can be both genuine and uneven. Here's what most people miss. When people say the city fixed it, they often mean the city made it easier not to think about. This is the same logic you see when a platform fixes harassment by making it harder to report, or when a company solves pollution by moving factories to places with weaker regulations. The metrics improve, the story improves, the harm doesn't vanish, it migrates. London's sanitation revolution is far more beneficial than those cynical examples. But the structural lesson rhymes. Systems rarely erase consequences. They reorganize them. Anchors to hold as we close. The Great Stink's crisis peak in June to July 1858. The Metropolitan Board of Works, created 1855, as the coordinating authority. The major sewer works unfolding through the 1860s, reshaping London's riverfront and public health landscape. And the material evidence still exists in the city's shape: embankments, pumping infrastructure, the hidden arteries beneath streets, engineering that continues to influence how London functions. This is a rare kind of historical legacy you can walk on top of without knowing it. And that's when everything changes. Because the Great Stink, at its core, is not a story about sewage. It's a story about the moment a society learns it cannot outsource its own consequences forever. They believed the solutions made sense because they aligned with Victorian faith in order and progress, and because the crisis made delay feel unbearable. They believed that modernity could be built, that nature could be managed, that the capital must be protected, and that engineering could succeed where moralizing had failed. And they were right in important ways. But they also believed often that once the stink was gone from the center, the problem was solved. That belief is understandable. Relief is persuasive. Relief tells you the danger is over. History tells you the conditions can return if you stop paying attention. And that brings us to our recurring line. One last time, where it belongs. A city can hide its mistakes until summer makes them speak, so the full arc in a breath. London grows faster than its systems. The Thames becomes a waste channel disguised as a river. Miasma belief turns smell into fear. Cholera haunts the city. Evidence fights worldview. Then summer, 1858, humiliates power into action. Bazalgette sewers and the embankment transform London. dramatically improving life in the capital's core, while also revealing the moral complexity of shifting burdens downstream. The city becomes modern not through a single revelation, but through an uncomfortable negotiation with its own consequences. There's a quiet truth at the end of the Great Stink. Civilizations are judged less by what they proclaim, and more by what they build to protect ordinary life. The Great Stink is a reminder that public health is not just medicine. It's architecture, it's budgets, it's whose suffering is loud enough to matter. And it's also a warning that feels uncomfortably current. We often wait to fix the hidden systems until they break in a way that becomes socially unbearable. So if this documentary stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the water you drink, the air you breathe, the invisible networks under your feet, then consider liking and subscribing. Not for the algorithm's sake, but because these long, slow history journeys only work when people choose to spend time with them. And one last question to carry with you, maybe into tomorrow. What does your world treat as background, right up until it becomes impossible to ignore? Next time, if you want another deep, strange, psychologically rich urban story, we can go somewhere equally overlooked and quietly terrifying. The 1665 plague year in London, fear, rumour, quarantine, and the theatre of survival.